Hello everyone, I am the Creep's Cabin. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from? And what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. Hunting was never something I enjoyed. I wasn't against it, not really. If someone needed to hunt for food, that made sense. But shooting animals for fun, for sport, just to mount a head on the wall or brag about it, that never sat right with me. But my dad and most of my family were into it, and when I was a kid, I didn't have much of a choice in the matter. If they planned a trip, I was going, whether I liked it or not. I remember the trip in bits and pieces, but the main event, the part that stuck with me, that I'll never forget, is burned into my brain like a scar. I must have been about 10, maybe 11, and we were deep in the woods, somewhere far from town. It was the kind of place where you couldn't hear cars or see power lines, where the only sounds were the wind, the birds, and sometimes, in the distance, the sharp crack of a rifle. I didn't want to shoot anything. I wasn't even holding a gun. My dad and the others had set up different hunting blinds in the area, and they stationed me at one of the ground blinds so I could act as a lookout. I had a radio and was supposed to call in if I saw any deer moving in their direction. That was my job, watch, wait, report. Simple enough. But hunting is boring when you're a kid, especially when you're not actually hunting. I brought my Game Boy with me, a handful of cartridges stuffed into my backpack. I spent the first couple of hours grinding through Pokemon battles, losing track of time as I trained my team. The woods were quiet, peaceful in a way, but after a while, the stillness got to me. It wasn't fear, not exactly, but a kind of restlessness. It felt like the trees were watching, like the silence had weight to it. I turned off my game and shifted in my seat, stretching my legs. My back was sore from sitting in the same position for too long. I figured I'd swap out my game and play something else for a while. I unzipped my backpack and started digging through it, pushing aside the spare batteries, the flashlight, the snacks I had packed. That's when I heard the sound. A strange whooshing noise, soft but close. Almost like wind through the trees, but different, too close, too sudden. I stopped what I was doing and listened. Nothing, just silence. I frowned, peering around the blind, but I couldn't see anything unusual. Curiosity got the better of me. I stepped outside, walking carefully around the blind, trying to find the source of the sound. The woods looked the same as they had all day, still, shadowed, endless. Then I reached the back of the blind and saw it. The entire outer wall was covered in spiders. Not just a few, not just a scattering. The whole surface was a writhing, interlinked mass of daddy long legs, packed together so thickly that I couldn't even see the wood beneath them. Their thin legs twitched and shifted, their tiny bodies moving like one giant organism. I felt something in my stomach twist and drop. My whole body went cold. I don't remember making a conscious decision to move. 1 second I was standing there, staring in horror, and the next I was stepping backward, my breath caught in my throat. I wanted to run. I should have run, but I had no idea where I was. My dad had driven me out here, and I wasn't sure how to get back to camp. Running blind through the woods seemed like a great way to get lost. That left one option: get rid of the spiders. My brain wasn't working properly. Panic had overridden logic, and instead of just leaving the blind and waiting somewhere else, I came up with what, at the time, seemed like a great plan. I had a can of bug spray in my backpack. I also had a lighter. Fire kills bugs, right? I grabbed the can and the lighter, my hands shaking. I positioned myself near the wall, angled the can, and flicked the lighter open. The second the flame touched the mist of bug spray, a burst of fire shot forward, a bright, concentrated jet aimed directly at the spiders. It worked at first. The flames spread fast, and the spiders began to shrivel and curl, their legs twitching wildly. But I had made a mistake. I was standing downwind. The moment the fire hit them, they let go. Thousands of flaming spiders detached from the wall all at once, thrown into the air by the heat and wind. And they came right at me. I don't know if I screamed. I must have. All I remember is the sheer, blind terror as they hit me, burning, twitching, falling into my hair, skittering down my shirt, sticking to my arms. I lost my mind. I dropped everything and started rolling on the ground, trying to get them off, but it wasn't working. They were everywhere. I could feel them, smell them, tiny sizzling bodies against my skin. I ripped off my jacket, then my shirt, then everything else. I didn't care. I didn't care if I was rolling half naked in the dirt, covered in scratches and leaves. I just needed them gone. My skin was red and stung all over, whether from burns or bites or sheer terror, I wasn't sure. I grabbed the radio, my hands shaking so badly I could barely press the button. I didn't think. I just yelled for my dad, told him to come get me, that we were leaving, that I was done. I don't remember what I said exactly, but I know I cursed, something I never did around him. I know I was crying. The wait for him to arrive felt like hours. In reality, it was probably 15 minutes, maybe less. When he pulled up in the truck, I was still standing there, breathing hard, my whole body trembling. My clothes were scattered on the ground. The blind was still smoldering slightly where the fire had caught. He didn't ask questions, not at first. He just told me to get in the truck. I did. We drove back to camp in silence. When we got there, the others looked confused. My dad said something to them, quiet and firm, and then we started packing up. We went home that night. I never went hunting again. I had nightmares for years after that, waking up in a sweat, convinced I could still feel them crawling on me. I went through therapy, tried to work through it, tried to rationalize it. It helped a little, but to this day, I hate spiders. I don't care how small they are, how harmless. I don't care if they eat mosquitoes or keep the ecosystem in balance. I don't want them near me. I don't even want to look at them, because I know what it feels like to be covered in them, and I never, ever want to feel that again. When I was a child, I lived in an old Victorian house with my mother. It was just the two of us. She worked long hours, and I spent a lot of time alone. The house was big, far too big for just the two of us, and it had that old smell, dust, wood, something deeper, something that never really went away no matter how much she cleaned. The floors creaked when you walked, and the windows rattled even when there was no wind. I never liked being alone at night, but I had no choice. My mother would put me to bed, turn off the light, and tell me to sleep. It started when I was around 5 or 6. I would be lying in bed, trying to drift off, and I'd hear laughter. At first, I thought it was coming from outside. The neighborhood was quiet, but sometimes you'd hear the odd person walking home late at night, talking, laughing. But this was different. It wasn't outside. It was in the house. The laughter was soft at first, like a whisper of amusement. Then it would grow louder. It always started in the hallway outside my room. I would pull my blankets up to my chin and stay as still as I could, trying to convince myself I was imagining it. But it kept happening, night after night. It didn't matter if I went to sleep early or late. At some point, the laughter would start, and I would lie awake, listening, heart pounding. I told my mother about it once. She just shook her head and said it was probably the TV. She liked to leave it on sometimes when she was too tired to turn it off before falling asleep. It made sense, I guess. TVs make noises, but something about it didn't sit right with me. The laughter sounded too close, too real, like someone was right outside my door. One night, I woke up and the laughter wasn't in the hallway. It was in my room. I knew it instantly. It wasn't muffled by the walls anymore. It was right there, in the dark, too close. My stomach tightened, and I tried to sit up, but I couldn't move. Something was holding me down. I felt pressure on my shoulders, 2 hands pressing me into the mattress. The laughter continued, not loud, not hysterical, just amused, like someone was enjoying a joke only they understood. I couldn't see anything. My room was pitch dark, but I knew something was there. The weight on my shoulders was real. The fingers digging into my skin were real. I tried to scream, but my breath caught in my throat. I squeezed my eyes shut and thrashed, trying to break free. Then suddenly I could move. The pressure vanished, and I screamed, loud enough to wake the entire neighborhood. My mother burst into my room, flicking on the light. She rushed to my bed, her hands on my face, asking me what was wrong. I was shaking, my chest heaving. She kept saying it was just a bad dream, that I was okay, but my shoulders hurt. The skin where I had felt the hands pressing down was sore, burning. I told her, and she hesitated. Then she lifted my shirt to look. I remember the way her face changed. 1 second, she was tired and annoyed, and the next she was pale, her mouth slightly open. I didn't understand why at first, but then she turned me towards the mirror. 2 handprints, clear as day, not small ones, not like a child's hands. They were big, adult-sized, fingers spread wide, pressing deep into my skin, already starting to bruise. She didn't say anything. She just sat there, staring. Then she shook her head, muttered something under her breath, and told me to go back to sleep. I didn't want to. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I just lay there, listening, waiting, staring at the door, half expecting to see someone standing there, smiling. After that night, the laughter stopped. It was just gone. Years passed, and I stopped thinking about it. I grew up, moved out, got my own place. The house was sold after my mother retired, and I never really thought about it again. It became one of those strange childhood memories, the kind you chalk up to imagination or being half asleep. I convinced myself it wasn't real. Then one day, I was talking to my mother about something completely unrelated, and the memory came back to me. I laughed about it, like it was some silly thing from when I was little, just a dream I had once. But my mother didn't laugh. She didn't say anything at first. Then she looked at me, and I saw something in her expression I hadn't seen before. She went pale, like all the blood had drained from her face. She shook her head and whispered, "I don't want to remember that." That was all she said. But the way she said it, the look in her eyes, it told me everything. It wasn't just a dream. It was real. I lived in a bizarre little house as a child. It was incredibly tall and thin, like an attached house except freestanding, with 3 floors, a basement, and an attic. The house was old, really old, and everything about it felt strange, like it had been built in pieces over time by people who never talked to each other. The layout barely made sense. There were 2 fully functional fireplaces, one on the first floor and one in my parents' bedroom, but they were set at odd angles, making it impossible to arrange furniture properly. The kitchen was cramped, yet there was a dumbwaiter that went from there to my bedroom on the 3rd floor, something no one ever had a reason to use. The backyard was a joke, more of an afterthought, so small that you couldn't take 5 steps without hitting the fence. The basement had a single, exposed shower stall in the middle of the floor, with no walls around it, just sitting there like an unfinished idea. I loved the house, but it was undeniably weird. My parents loved it too, at least for a while. They were the kind of people who appreciated character in a home, but the house was just too much work. Everything needed fixing. The floors creaked like they were crying under our weight. The walls had cracks that always seemed to grow back no matter how many times they were patched, and every winter. The windows let in gusts of cold air no matter how tightly they were shut. Eventually, the cost of maintaining the place became too high, and my parents decided we had to move. Packing was a nightmare. My room was on the 3rd floor, and my closet was a disaster. I had the habit of stuffing my clothes into it without folding them, and over time, they had compressed into a solid, impenetrable mass. Instead of sorting through them like a normal person, I decided to throw them down the dumbwaiter in chunks and deal with them later. The dumbwaiter was my personal garbage chute for the week, taking in armfuls of old toys, notebooks, and anything else I didn't feel like carrying downstairs. I was getting close to finishing when I noticed something I had never seen before. At the top of my closet, there was a square cut into the ceiling, almost blending into the white paint. An attic entrance. I had never seen it before, or maybe I had and just never cared. I wasn't the type of kid who looked up much. Now, with my room mostly empty and curiosity burning in my chest, I decided to take a look. I pushed against the panel, and it lifted easily, revealing a dark space above. Standing on top of the clothes brick, I hoisted myself up and climbed inside. The first thing I noticed was the light. It wasn't as dark as an attic should be. Strands of old red Christmas lights were strung haphazardly across the wooden beams, their faint glow still lingering like embers from a fire. They shouldn't have been on. There was no reason they should still work, yet they did. Small cracks in the floor let slivers of light from the bedrooms below peek through, creating thin lines of illumination across the dusty space. The second thing I noticed was that the attic wasn't just a storage space. It had been lived in. The insulation had been pushed aside and covered with plastic, like someone had made an effort to keep the cold out. In one corner, there was an old gurney, piled with sleeping bags and sheets, as if someone had used it as a bed. Next to it, an ancient mint green refrigerator stood, its door slightly ajar. Out of curiosity, I pulled it open. The bulb inside flickered weakly, casting light on a few empty shelves and a lone, shriveled apple sitting at the back. The fridge still worked. I closed it, my stomach twisting. The third thing I noticed was the bones. They were everywhere. Piles of them. stacked haphazardly in the center of the attic. Some were small, others were long and thick, and none of them looked fresh. They were dry, brittle, picked clean. I wasn't an expert on anatomy, but I could tell they weren't all from the same type of animal. There were some that looked like chicken bones, others like ribs, and some that were so large I didn't want to think about what they had belonged to. 2 of the piles had been blackened, as if they had been burned, and near those piles, the walls were marked with dark streaks of something charred and greasy. Among those smears, one word appeared more than once: sorry. I stood frozen, my heartbeat so loud I could hear it in my ears. That room had been above me for 8 years. While I slept, while I played, while I lived my life, someone had been up here. Someone had been using this space. Someone had been burning things. I suddenly became very aware of the thinness of the walls, of how easily a person could move through this house without being heard. I scrambled back to the entrance, nearly slipping on the uneven floorboards. I didn't even bother closing the attic panel as I half fell, half climbed back into my closet. My hands were shaking. I tried to tell myself that the bones weren't human, that someone had just been a strange collector, that the blackened piles weren't what I thought they were. But the word on the wall, sorry, stuck in my mind like a thorn. I didn't tell my parents. I don't know why. Maybe I was scared they wouldn't believe me, or maybe I didn't want to hear an explanation that would make it worse. I spent my last nights in that house lying awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering if I had ever heard something moving up there before and just ignored it. Wondering if whoever had been up there had ever watched me through those cracks in the floor. Wondering if they had ever come down. We moved a few days later. I never went back. My parents sold the house to a couple who planned to renovate it, and I tried not to think about what they might find if they ever opened that attic. Years later, I looked up the house again out of morbid curiosity. It had been sold twice more after we left, but the last listing mentioned something strange. The attic entrance had been permanently sealed. No explanation. Just sealed. I wonder if they saw what I saw, or if they saw something worse. I was 17 when it happened, and I still think about it more than I'd like to admit. The house next to my friend's had always been a mystery, but not the kind people told stories about. There weren't any rumors of hauntings, no tragic history that we knew of. Just a normal-looking house that never kept its owners for more than 6 months at a time. People moved in, then left suddenly, sometimes in the dead of night. No for sale signs, no moving trucks, just empty windows where people had been weeks before. It became sort of a background oddity, something we noticed but never really talked about much. Until that night. We were bored, just wandering the neighborhood like we always did, kicking at rocks and talking about whatever 17-year-olds talk about. It was cold, the kind of December cold that makes you pull your hoodie sleeves over your hands. My friend, who lived next door to the house, had been the one to bring it up. He just casually mentioned how the place had been empty for a while, and we should check it out. It didn't take much convincing. We weren't looking for anything specific, just a way to kill time. We walked around back, keeping quiet even though we knew no one was inside. The back door was locked, but there was a dog door at the bottom. My friend, being smaller than me, squeezed through first and fumbled around in the dark until I heard the back door click open. Inside, the air was stale, like a room that hadn't been touched in years. It wasn't a bad smell, just heavy like dust and old wood. The house itself was unremarkable, a typical mid-century craftsman with a layout almost identical to my friend's place. We walked through the kitchen, where a built-in breakfast nook sat against a large picture window facing the street. The electricity was off, but the glow from the streetlight outside cut across the wooden floor. We sat on the ground, backs against the cabinets, just talking about nothing. It was stupid, but it felt weirdly peaceful. I don't know how long we were there before it happened. 1 second, I was sitting there, and the next, my entire body was swallowed by cold. Not just a shiver or a draft, but a suffocating, solid cold that clung to my skin like something wet and thick. My vision cut out completely. Just blackness, not even the usual shapes you see in the dark. I could still hear my friend, but it was distant, like he was yelling at me from underwater. Then I was screaming too, or at least I think I was. I could feel my hands moving, reaching blindly, but nothing felt real, like I was somewhere else entirely. Suddenly, I felt my friend's hands grab mine, yanking me forward with so much force I stumbled. The cold started to lift, my vision returning in patches. By the time everything came back, We were outside, standing under the streetlight. My legs felt unsteady, my breath coming in ragged gasps, but the cold was gone. The night air felt warm in comparison, even though I knew it was freezing. I turned to my friend. His face was pale, his hands still gripping my wrist like he wasn't sure if I was really there. He looked terrified. I was too confused to even ask what had happened right away. My body still felt strange, like whatever had happened inside was lingering just under my skin. I wasn't sure how much time had passed. Later, when we finally talked about it, he told me he'd seen something crawl out from under the table. A shape black, but not just in color. He couldn't describe it, only that it didn't reflect light. Didn't seem like it was even part of the room. It had the vague outline of a girl, he said, but there was nothing human about it. It moved fast, climbing over me, and that was when my body just stopped responding. He'd panicked, grabbed me, and pulled me out, barely registering if I was moving on my own. For the next few days, I couldn't shake the feeling. It clung to me like a smell you can't wash off. I avoided that house completely, crossing the street just to keep from walking past it. It wasn't fear, not exactly. It was something worse, a deep, unsettled feeling in my gut that told me something had touched me that night, something I couldn't explain. I never went back. The house went up for sale again a month later, and another family moved in. They stayed for 4 months before leaving just as suddenly as the others. The cycle continued. I don't know what happened in there, and I don't want to know. I just know that in those few minutes, I felt something I've never felt before or since. Something heavy, something real. And to this day, I have never experienced cold like that again. It started small, little things that I brushed off as forgetfulness. I lived alone in a small house on the outskirts of town, a place just big enough for me and no one else. The days blurred together, work taking up most of my time, and when I came home, I wanted nothing more than to relax. I wasn't one for guests, and I wasn't the type to misplace things, but strange things started happening, and I convinced myself it was all in my head. It was the soup that made me notice first. I had made a large pot, enough to last me through the week, but each time I went back for another serving, it seemed like there was less than I remembered. I chalked it up to misjudging portions or forgetting I had eaten more than I thought. Then there were the eggs, a carton that should have been mostly full suddenly missing several. I stood there staring at the open fridge, trying to recall if I had used them for something, but nothing came to mind. Things kept adding up, an extra dish in the dishwasher when I hadn't cooked, towels in the hamper damp when I hadn't used them. The thermostat set slightly higher or lower than I remembered. I was tired, overworked, and I convinced myself that I was just being forgetful. I even laughed about it sometimes, thinking I was losing my mind over something so silly. Then I started hearing noises. At first, I thought it was just the house settling, an old place shifting in the wind. But some nights, when I lay in bed, I swore I heard something, faint, almost imperceptible, but there. A scuff, a shift, a sound that wasn't part of my normal home. I checked the doors, the windows, made sure everything was locked. I told myself it was just my imagination. One night, I heard it clearly, thumping, not just a creak or a whisper of sound, but something solid. It was coming from above me. I froze in bed, listening, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. The attic. The thought sent a chill through me. I hadn't been up there in months. There was nothing up there but old boxes and dust. I didn't move at first. I listened, hoping it was a one-time thing. But then it happened again. A faint but distinct shift, the sound of movement. Something was up there. I forced myself out of bed, my legs unsteady as I grabbed a flashlight. I moved carefully, every step on the wooden floor sounding too loud in the silence. The attic hatch was in the hallway. I stood beneath it, staring up at the pull string, my breath coming fast. I reached up, pulled it down, and unfolded the ladder. The air that drifted down smelled stale, with a faint hint of something else, something that didn't belong. I climbed slowly, the flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. When my head cleared the attic floor, I stopped, the light sweeping across the space. I wasn't alone. In the far corner, against the wall, was a setup that had no reason to be there. A sleeping bag, a small radio, a hot plate, a pillow, scattered food wrappers. My brain struggled to make sense of it, to piece together what I was looking at. Someone had been living here. Someone had been in my house. I scrambled down the ladder, my hands shaking as I grabbed my phone and called the police. I couldn't stay there. I waited outside, pacing in the cold night air until I saw the flashing lights. The officers searched the house, found nothing, but they saw what I saw in the attic. They told me they would keep an eye on the place, to let them know if I noticed anything else. I didn't sleep that night, barely slept the next. I kept expecting to hear something, to feel something watching me. Days passed, and nothing happened, but I knew someone had been there. I had proof of it. I locked every door and window, checked them twice before bed, listened for the slightest sound. I was terrified of being alone in my own home. Then a week later, the police caught him. He had been climbing a tree, trying to sneak back into the attic through a small window. A homeless man, thin and quiet, eyes wary but not threatening. He had been doing this for months, waiting for me to leave for work, then slipping down into the house to eat, to shower, to exist in a place that wasn't the streets. I should have been angry. I should have been horrified. But standing there, looking at him, I felt something else. Pity. He hadn't trashed my house, hadn't stolen anything beyond food and warmth. He had lived just above me, unseen, unheard, careful not to disturb more than necessary. He had been respectful, in a strange, unsettling way. I didn't press charges. Maybe I should have, but I didn't. Instead, I talked to him, learned about him. He had fallen on hard times, lost his job, lost his place to live, and he had been too ashamed to ask for help. My attic had become his shelter. He hadn't meant to scare me, hadn't wanted to hurt me. He was just trying to survive. It was an odd thing, to go from fear to understanding. I helped him. I let him stay, not in the attic, but in the house, a real place to sleep. I helped him find a job, helped him get back on his feet. It wasn't immediate, but over time, he built himself back up. He found a place of his own, moved out, started fresh. It was one of the strangest experiences of my life. Something that should have left me shaken and afraid, but instead, it ended in something unexpected. A chance encounter, a strange invasion of my home that turned into something else entirely. A story I would tell for years, a reminder that sometimes things aren't always what they seem. But even after he left, even after I knew I was alone again, I still found myself listening at night, waiting for the sound of something moving above me. It happened about 10 years ago, but I only heard about it recently from my mother. When she told me, I felt a chill run down my spine. Our family wasn't one to believe in ghosts or anything like that. We never talked about the paranormal or entertained spooky stories. But this was different. This was real. My cousin was 17, maybe 18, when she got into a car accident. She fought in the hospital for a couple of weeks, but in the end, she didn't make it. It was hard for everyone, but especially for my dad's sister, our aunt. My cousin used to babysit for her all the time. She was close to our aunt's kids, who weren't much older than 4 at the time. They adored her. At the time of my cousin's accident, my aunt's house was under construction. It wasn't anything major, just an expansion, a new section being built to give the kids more space to play. The construction had started just before my cousin's accident and continued on after she passed. The workers were there every day, hammering, sawing, putting up drywall, and doing whatever else construction workers do. Then my aunt got a call. She was at work when it happened, busy with something, when her phone rang. It was one of the construction workers. He sounded annoyed, maybe a little concerned. He told her there was a teenage girl who kept showing up at the house, walking around, just appearing at random times. It had been happening for weeks. She wasn't doing anything, just standing there, walking through the site, then disappearing again. The workers would see her one moment, then she'd be gone. It wasn't just one worker who saw her, multiple people did, all at different times. My aunt was confused. She didn't know any teenage girls who lived nearby who might be nosing around the construction site. She asked the worker to describe her. Long brown hair, red baseball cap, denim dungarees, white jacket. A jolt of recognition ran through her. She knew exactly who that was. Her stomach turned, her hands went cold. She asked him to repeat it. Long brown hair, red baseball cap, denim dungarees, white jacket. Her throat closed up. That was exactly what my cousin had been wearing the last time she babysat the kids. She always wore that red baseball cap. She loved it. The denim dungarees were a hand-me-down she had worn for years, and the white jacket was her favorite. That was her. My aunt didn't say anything on the phone. What could she say? Instead, she went home that evening, digging through her photo albums until she found a picture of my cousin in that outfit. The next morning, she brought the picture to the construction site and showed it to the workers. Every single one of them pointed at the photo and said, "That's her." They were sure. It wasn't a guess. They weren't confused. They weren't mixing her up with some other local girl. That was the girl they had been seeing walking through the construction site for weeks. But my cousin had been dead for weeks. There was no logical explanation for it. My aunt tried to come up with one, but nothing made sense. Maybe it had been some other girl who just happened to look exactly like her. But why would a random teenager be walking around a construction site for weeks, wearing the exact same clothes my cousin had last been seen in? It didn't add up. The construction workers were just as disturbed as she was. They weren't the kind of men who got spooked easily. They had seen all sorts of things working on different sites, but this was different. They had all seen her at different times, not just once, but over and over. One worker had seen her standing near the unfinished doorway, looking out towards the backyard. Another had spotted her walking up the stairs that hadn't been completed yet. She had been seen standing near the edge of the property, staring at the woods. She never spoke. She never interacted with them. She was just there. The sighting stopped after that. Once my aunt brought the picture and told them who she was, no one saw her again. The house was finished a few months later. The workers left, and life went on. My aunt never saw anything strange in the house, never heard anything at night, never felt anything off. It was as if my cousin had just been there, making sure everything was okay, making sure the house she had spent so much time in was being built properly. Then, when she was satisfied, she left. We never talked about it much after that. My aunt didn't like to bring it up. She wasn't the kind of person to believe in ghosts, and even though she couldn't explain what had happened, she didn't want to dwell on it. Maybe it was just a case of mistaken identity. Maybe the workers had seen someone else. But if that was true, why did it stop the moment she showed them the photo? Why did it stop after they acknowledged who it was? I don't know. I'll never know. But every time I pass by my aunt's house, I think about it. I think about my cousin, standing in the half-built house, watching over it. And I wonder if, for those few weeks, she had really been there after all. It was late afternoon, just starting to get dark, the sky turning from blue to orange as the sun lowered behind the buildings. The heat of the pavement still clung to the air, radiating off the sidewalk as my friends and I skated toward July 11th. My board clattered over cracks in the pavement, the wheels humming beneath me. Tim and Brandon skated beside me, their shirts dark with sweat from hours of messing around at the park. We were just kids, tired and hungry, and the thought of cold drinks and snacks made our stomachs rumble. We rolled into the 7-Eleven parking lot, kicking up our boards as we reached the door. The glass doors slid open with a mechanical hiss, the blast of AC hitting us in the face as we walked inside. The place smelled like hot dogs and spilled Slurpee. I grabbed a bottle of soda from the fridge, the condensation cold against my hand. Tim grabbed a bag of chips, Brandon picked up a candy bar, and we all made our way to the register, counting out crumpled bills and loose change to pay. When we stepped outside, the heat hit us again. We cracked open our drinks, taking long swigs before walking toward the parking lot exit. The highway stretched in front of us, the traffic light glowing red as cars rolled past. It wasn't a busy highway, just a small-town road with a few cars here and there, but we still had to wait for the light to change before crossing. As I stood there, sipping my drink, I glanced back toward the gas pumps. A white truck was parked at one of them, and a man stood next to it, pumping gas. He looked to be in his 40s or 50s, scruffy, wearing a stained t-shirt and jeans. I didn't think much of him at first, but then I noticed he was staring. Not just looking in our direction, staring directly at me. His expression was blank, but there was something off about the way his eyes locked onto mine, like he wasn't just looking but studying me. A weird feeling crept over me, but I forced myself to shake it off. He was probably just zoned out or something. Then, without warning, he dropped the gas pump. The nozzle fell from his hands, gasoline spilling onto the pavement as he lunged into his truck. The engine roared to life, and before I could process what was happening, he hit the gas and came straight at us. The truck flew across the parking lot, tires screeching as it barreled toward us. I barely had time to react. I jumped back, my drink slipping from my fingers, shattering against the ground as I stumbled. The truck missed me by inches, but I felt the force of it graze my arm, knocking my skateboard from my hand. Brandon shouted something, his voice full of shock and rage, but my brain was too scrambled to understand. The truck didn't stop. It screeched around the corner, disappearing into the parking lot next to 7-Eleven. For a second, we stood there, frozen. My heart hammered against my ribs, my breath coming in short, uneven gasps. Then, before we could even react, the truck came back. It didn't use the road. It cut straight through a ditch that separated the two lots, bouncing wildly as it climbed over the curb. The engine roared, the front bumper dipping with the impact before the truck sped toward us again. This wasn't some accident. This wasn't a mistake. This guy was trying to run us down. Panic surged through me. We ran. We had no plan, no time to think, just pure survival instincts kicking in. The three of us bolted, our legs pumping as fast as they could. The highway stretched ahead, cars rolling past. I didn't even look. I just ran. The truck skidded behind us, tires screaming against the pavement as the driver tried to follow. I sprinted across the highway, barely registering the honk of a car as I made it to the other side. My feet hit the sidewalk, my chest burning, my breath ragged. Tim and Brandon were just ahead of me, their eyes wide with panic. The library was up ahead, just a few blocks away. That was the only place we could go. Brandon and Tim reached the library first. I saw them sprint up the steps, yanking at the doors, but they didn't budge. Closed. It was Sunday. I had known that, but in my blind panic, I had hoped otherwise. They banged on the doors, looking back at me, their faces twisted with fear. I didn't stop. I knew better. The library wouldn't save us. I veered left, toward the woods. A trail ran through there, leading straight to my backyard. If I could just make it home, if I could just disappear into the trees, maybe I'd be safe. I could hear the truck. The engine roared, tires skidding, gravel crunching as it peeled into the library parking lot. I glanced back for only a second, just long enough to see the man jump out. He wasn't done. He was still coming. His hand grabbed something from the bed of the truck. A shotgun? A crowbar? I couldn't tell, but the sight of him reaching for a weapon sent a fresh wave of terror through me. I ran. My legs burned, my lungs screamed, but I didn't stop. I pushed harder, feet pounding against the dirt as I plunged into the woods. The branches tore at my arms, my shirt catching on brambles as I forced my way through. My breaths came in short gasps, sweat dripping down my face. I couldn't hear him anymore, but I didn't dare look back. I just ran. I don't know how long I sprinted before my house came into view. It could have been minutes. It could have been hours. Time blurred together in my mind. I stumbled into my backyard, my body shaking, adrenaline still pumping through my veins. My street was quiet, normal, like none of this had even happened. Tim's dad was outside. He saw me, his face twisting in confusion before telling me to get in his car. I could barely think straight. The next thing I knew, we were at the video store where Tim's mom worked. Tim and Brandon were already there, standing beside 3 cops. My mom arrived minutes later, tears streaking down her face. She thought I had been taken. They all did. Tim told me later that he saw the man running after me into the woods. I had no idea. I thought he was chasing them, but he had been after me the whole time. The cops took a report, but it didn't matter. The man was never caught. No security footage, no real witnesses willing to come forward. Just a vague description of a white truck and a middle-aged man who had vanished as quickly as he appeared. For years after, I couldn't shake the fear. Every time I saw a white truck, my stomach twisted into knots. I'd watch them, my body tensing, ready to run. Even though I knew it probably wasn't him, the fear never fully went away. It stayed with me, a constant shadow in the back of my mind, reminding me of the day I ran for my life while the world around me just kept going, as if nothing had ever happened. When I was about 10, all my cousins and siblings were over at our house for the evening. There were about 10 of us in total, ranging from the youngest, who was probably 5, to the oldest, who was around 16. Our parents and grandparents had gone out for dinner, leaving us alone for the night. It wasn't unusual. We'd been left alone plenty of times before. The older kids were responsible enough to keep the younger ones in line, and we never did anything reckless. Mostly, we just sat around watching movies, playing games, and eating snacks. That night, we had settled in the living room, sprawled across the couch and floor with pillows and blankets. Someone had picked a movie, some light-hearted comedy, nothing scary. The house was quiet except for the hum of the television and the occasional rustling of a chip bag or someone shifting positions. It was comfortable, familiar. We were relaxed, lost in the movie, not expecting anything out of the ordinary. Then it happened. The entire house shook. It wasn't a slight tremor or a distant rumble. It was an explosion of sound and movement that rattled every window and made the walls tremble as if something massive had crashed into the house. A blinding flash of white light burst through the windows, flooding the room for a split second before disappearing just as fast. It wasn't lightning. There hadn't been any storm, no rain, no wind. The night had been still. This was something else. For that brief moment, it felt like a bomb had gone off in the backyard. The force of it was so intense that my ears rang, my chest felt tight, and my entire body tensed up. The younger kids screamed, some of them scrambling toward the nearest cousin for protection. No one stayed put. As if driven by instinct, we all bolted as a group toward the hallway, away from the windows and doors. It was pure survival, that primal urge to escape, to get somewhere safe. We huddled in the hallway, packed together, hearts pounding, breathing hard. The oldest cousins whispered urgently to each other, trying to decide what to do. There was no way we had imagined it. We had all heard it. We had all seen the light. The floor had shaken beneath us. Something had happened outside, something big. But what? One of the older cousins suggested calling the police. But another said we should call the parents first. After all, we had no idea what had happened. What would we even tell the cops? That something exploded in the backyard, but we had no proof? No one could decide, and we hesitated, stuck in a state of shock and uncertainty. The youngest ones clung to us, too scared to say much of anything. Minutes passed. The house was eerily quiet again. Whatever had happened, it was over now. But that only made it worse. The silence felt unnatural, like the world outside had frozen in place. Finally, someone suggested we go back into the living room and look outside. Maybe a tree had fallen. Maybe something had exploded. A transformer, maybe? It was a flimsy explanation, but we needed to see for ourselves. Gathering what little courage we had, we armed ourselves with whatever we could find: broomsticks, toy swords, even kitchen knives. It felt ridiculous, but we weren't taking any chances. We crept out of the hallway, our group moving as one, stepping carefully as if the floor might give way beneath us. The movie was still playing, but none of us paid attention to it anymore. The back door had a large window, and from there, we could see into the backyard. Someone reached for the light switch, but before they could flip it on, another cousin whispered that we should keep it off. If someone was out there, we didn't want to alert them. That thought sent a fresh wave of fear through us. What if this wasn't an accident? What if someone had caused that explosion? What if they were still out there, watching us? We pressed our faces to the glass, peering outside. The backyard was empty. The grass, the trees, the fence, everything looked exactly the same as it always had. There was no fire, no smoke, no damage that we could see. No fallen branches, no sign that anything had hit the ground. It didn't make sense. We had all felt it, seen it, heard it. But there was nothing there. We stayed like that for a long time, staring into the darkness, waiting for something to move, for another flash, another sound. But nothing came. Eventually, we pulled away from the window and returned to the living room, still holding our makeshift weapons. No one wanted to say it out loud, but we all had the same thought. We weren't safe yet. Half an hour passed, then an hour. The tension eased slightly, but no one fully relaxed. We didn't turn the movie back on. Some of us sat on the couch, others on the floor, still holding whatever we had picked up as a weapon. Every little sound made us flinch. The creak of the house settling, the hum of the refrigerator, the occasional thump of someone shifting position. Finally, we heard the sound of a car pulling into the driveway. The headlights flashed through the front windows. Our parents were home. The second they stepped through the door, we bombarded them with our story, talking over each other in frantic voices, trying to explain what had happened. The house shook. There was a huge flash of light. Something exploded in the backyard. We were so sure they would take us seriously, that they would rush outside and see for themselves. Instead, they looked at us like we were crazy. They checked the backyard. Nothing. No burn marks, no broken branches, no signs of anything unusual. They asked the neighbors. No one had seen or heard anything. No emergency vehicles had come through the area. Nothing had been reported. As far as the adults were concerned, it hadn't happened. But we knew it had. 10 of us had experienced it at the same time. It wasn't our imagination. It wasn't a dream. We still talk about it, even now, years later. Every time we bring it up, we go over the details again and again, trying to make sense of it, trying to find a logical explanation. But we never do. Whatever happened that night, it remains a mystery. Maybe something really did explode in the sky above us, something quick and untraceable. Maybe it was a freak electrical surge, something no one could explain. Or maybe it was something else entirely, something beyond what we could understand. All I know is that I have never felt fear like that again. Not the kind that grips you so completely, that sends you running before you even have time to think. The kind that stays with you for years, lurking in the back of your mind, whispering, "You weren't wrong. It really happened." And we'll never know why. Last summer, I was back at my parents' house for the holidays. I hadn't lived there full-time in years, but it still felt familiar. The layout of the house hadn't changed, my old room was the same, and the quiet suburban neighborhood still had that eerie stillness at night. It was peaceful, but sometimes a little too quiet. That night, I stayed up late. It was past 3 a.m., and I was at my desk, the soft glow of my computer screen the only light in the room. The house was dead silent, my parents asleep, the only sound the occasional creak of the walls settling. I was lost in whatever I was doing, barely paying attention to my surroundings, when my phone lit up. A call. My sister. It was weird. Her room was just down the hall. If she needed something, she would have just walked over. But maybe she didn't want to get up. Maybe she was feeling lazy. I reached for my phone, but the call ended before I could answer. A little confused, I stood up. I figured she still wanted to talk, so I walked out of my room and made my way to hers. The hallway was dark, the dim glow from the streetlight outside casting long shadows on the walls. As I reached her door, the silence was suddenly shattered by a scream. It was my sister. I didn't hesitate. I pushed her door open, heart hammering. She was sitting up in bed, shaking, eyes wide, breathing heavily. I scanned the room, my eyes adjusting to the darkness, expecting to see something. Someone, but there was nothing. Just her alone, trembling under her blanket. She was crying. She told me she woke up and saw a dark figure inches from her face. She barely had time to process it before she screamed. By the time I entered the room, it was gone, if there had even been anything there to begin with. I sat down next to her, trying to calm her down, telling her it was probably just a dream, that she had imagined it. But then I remembered the call. I told her she had called me. Her face twisted in confusion. She said she had been sleeping, that she hadn't touched her phone. I checked her nightstand. No phone. We searched her bed, under her pillow, nothing. I found it downstairs in her purse, untouched. I showed her my call log. Her number was there, the call time-stamped just before her scream. But when she checked her phone, there was nothing. No outgoing call, no record of it. We had no explanation. For the rest of the night, she refused to sleep alone. I stayed up, sitting in the hallway between our rooms, my back against the wall, listening for anything unusual. The house felt different, like something was watching. But the night passed without incident. The next morning, we told our parents. They brushed it off, saying it was just a nightmare. Maybe she sleepwalked and called me without realizing. Maybe a trick of the light made her see something. But I didn't buy it. Over the next few days, we tried to move past it, but something lingered in the air. A discomfort, the feeling that we weren't alone. Small things started happening. Lights we swore we turned off were on. Doors we left closed were slightly ajar. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe we were just being paranoid after what happened. A week later, I woke up in the middle of the night. I don't know what stirred me, but something felt off. I looked toward my door. It was open. I always closed it before bed. The hallway beyond was dark, silent. But I felt it, that same feeling I had the night my sister screamed. I stayed still, listening. My eyes adjusted to the dark, but I saw nothing. After a while, I got up, walked to the door, and peeked into the hallway. Nothing. I checked my sister's room. She was fast asleep. I told myself it was my imagination. But before I went back to bed, I checked my phone. My hands went cold. There was a missed call. From my sister. At 3 a.m. I was at a thrift store with some friends, looking for Halloween costumes. The place had that familiar, musty smell of old fabric and dust, mixed with the sharp scent of plastic from cheap costume masks. We had been there for maybe 20 minutes, picking through racks of clothes, laughing at the weird stuff people had donated over the years. I was in the dressing room, trying on an oversized jacket, when I heard someone walk in from outside. Their voice was loud, panicked. Someone's passed out in the parking lot. Everything got quiet. The kind of silence that only happens when people are trying to process something serious. I stepped out of the dressing room, the jacket half on, half off. I could see my friends looking at each other, unsure of what to do. "I'm certified," I said. The words came out automatically. It had only been a week since I got my CPR certification, and I'd never actually used it. But I knew what I had to do. "Call 911. I told them, and then I was already moving toward the door. The air outside was cool. The parking lot was mostly empty, just a few scattered cars parked near the store. I looked around, expecting to see someone on the ground, but I didn't see anything. "Over there," someone shouted from behind me. I turned and saw them pointing toward a car parked far out by itself, near the edge of the lot. I ran. My heart was already racing, but as I got closer to the car, it started pounding even harder. I could see her through the window before I even reached the door. She was slumped against the glass, completely still. Her face was blue. Not just pale, not just flushed blue. I had never seen a person that color before. Her lips, her cheeks, even the areas around her eyes, all a sickening, oxygen-deprived shade of blue. And her eyes, she had those red rings around them, the kind of look you see in people who've been using hard drugs for a long time. Except they weren't red anymore. They were dark, sunken, bruised-looking. My hands shook as I reached for the door handle, but it was locked. Someone else ran up behind me, and we tried the other doors. "Locked too." "Break it," someone said, but before we could, another person ran up with a metal tool, maybe a tire iron. One hit against the window, and the glass cracked. Another, and it shattered, falling in on itself. The moment the door was open, the smell hit me. A mix of sweat, old cigarette smoke, something sour, something chemical. Heroin needles littered the floor. Empty pill bottles rattled as they rolled against the plastic mats. I barely noticed any of it because the second we turned her head, I saw the tears on her cheeks. Even as she was dying, even as her body shut down, she had been crying. I don't know why that hit me the hardest, but it did. We pulled her out, laying her on the rough pavement. Someone checked her pulse, but they weren't sure. I pressed my fingers against her neck, searching, but I felt nothing. I started compressions, counting in my head, trying to focus on the steps I had learned. But her chest barely moved. Her body felt too still, too lifeless. The bones in her ribs cracked under the pressure. I had read about that happening, but hearing it, feeling it, was different. A minute in, I could hear the sirens. Someone else took over for me while I caught my breath. I looked at her again, really looked at her. She wasn't much older than me, maybe mid-20s at most. Her clothes were baggy, wrinkled. Her hair was tangled, stuck to the side of her face where she had been pressed against the car window. In the back seat, there were toys, a car seat, and on her arm, 2 names tattooed in looping script. The paramedics arrived fast. I backed up as they took over. One of them pulled out a syringe, Narcan, I realized. I had heard about it before, how it could sometimes reverse heroin overdoses if given in time. But as they injected it, I saw the way they looked at each other, like they already knew. More EMTs arrived, 6 in total. They worked fast, moving with the kind of coordination that only comes from experience. They strapped her to a stretcher, got an oxygen mask on her, continued compressions as they loaded her into the ambulance. A police officer stepped up beside me. He looked down at the needles on the ground, at the pill bottles, then at me. "They'll do what they can," he said. His voice was even professional, but not hopeful. But she was already pretty much gone. I nodded. I didn't know what else to say. The ambulances pulled away. The parking lot was still. The people who had gathered to watch started to drift off. My friends found me, asked if I was okay. I didn't know how to answer them. I felt empty. We went back inside the store, but I couldn't focus on anything. The racks of clothes, the weird old decorations, the cheap plastic masks, it all felt so distant, so meaningless. I kept seeing her face, the color of her skin, the tears on her cheeks, the tattoos on her arm, the car seat in the back of her car. She had been someone's mother, maybe someone's sister. someone's daughter. And now, she was probably gone. I don't know what happened after that. I never found out if she made it to the hospital alive, but I don't think she did. The way the EMTs looked, the way the cop talked, I think they already knew before they even took her away. It's been years since that night, but I still think about her sometimes. About the way her body felt under my hands as I tried to bring her back. About the way she must have felt in those last moments, alone in her car, with only the sound of her own breath slipping away. I was only 19. It was the first time I had to use CPR, and it didn't save her. I don't think I'll ever forget her. I went to my girlfriend's house about a month ago. It wasn't my first time there. I'd been over plenty of times before, sat on the same couch, eaten at the same table, walked the same hallway. But something felt different that night. The moment I stepped into the living room, a thick, uneasy feeling settled into my chest. I tried to ignore it, shaking it off as nothing. Maybe I was just tired. But as I sat down, I kept looking toward the corner where a cabinet stood. It wasn't the one I was used to seeing. This one was darker, older. It looked expensive, well-kept, but out of place in the room. It had tall, narrow doors on the sides, glass in the front, and a mirror at the back. My girlfriend must have noticed me looking because she told me her family had replaced the old cabinet with this one. It had belonged to her grandmother, who had passed away a few months ago. I had never met her grandmother. She had been bedridden for a long time in the hospital before she died. Still, hearing that only made me feel worse. The air in the room felt thick, like it was pressing down on me. It was stupid, but being near that cabinet made me feel anxious, like something heavy was sitting on my chest. There was a sadness to it, something I couldn't put into words. My girlfriend didn't think anything of it. She said it was probably nothing and went to the bathroom. I stayed in the living room, trying to ignore the feeling in my gut, but my eyes kept drifting back to that cabinet. Something about it felt off. I walked over, standing in front of it, looking through the glass at the things inside. There were small porcelain dolls, their painted faces blank and staring. Delicate teacups with thin gold rims. Old trinkets, little things that probably meant something to her grandmother. My reflection in the glass stared back at me, slightly distorted by the angles of the cabinet. Then, for a split second, I thought I saw movement in the mirror behind the glass. Just a silhouette. It was behind me. I turned fast, heart pounding, but there was nothing. Just the empty living room. The couch, the coffee table, the dim light from the hallway. I swallowed, trying to calm myself down. Maybe it was just a trick of the glass. My mind playing games with me. Then I heard the scream. High-pitched, sharp, and coming from the bathroom. I ran, my feet moving before I could think. I pounded on the door, calling her name, but she didn't answer. My stomach dropped. I twisted the knob, expecting it to be locked, but it wasn't. The door swung open. She was on the floor. She wasn't hurt, but she was shaking, her back against the cabinets beneath the sink. Her eyes were wide, her face pale. She was crying, her breath coming in short, uneven gasps. She wouldn't look at me. She was staring at the mirror. I followed her gaze. Nothing was there, just our reflections. I asked what happened, but she couldn't get the words out. She kept shaking her head, looking at the mirror like she was afraid it would move. I grabbed her arm, pulled her up, and we ran. Out the door. No shoes, no jackets. Into the cold night air. We didn't stop. We got in my car, slammed the doors, locked them. My hands were shaking as I put the keys in the ignition. I pulled out of the driveway fast, too fast, but I didn't care. I just needed to get away from that house. We didn't talk. Not for a long time. We just drove. I don't know how long. An hour, maybe more. Just driving with no destination, the road stretching ahead in the dark. Eventually, I had to take her home. I didn't want to, but I couldn't keep driving forever. When we pulled up, her mom was outside, sitting on the doorstep. She was waiting for us. She looked tired, like she had been sitting there for a while. She stood up as we got out of the car, her arms crossed against the cold. She didn't look angry. She looked unsettled. She said she kept seeing shadows move in the house. I didn't want to go back inside. Neither did my girlfriend. But what could we do? It was her home. I walked her up to the door. Her mom held it open for us, stepping aside. I hesitated. That heavy feeling was still there, pressing on my ribs. But I took a breath and stepped inside. The house was quiet. Nothing looked different. The same furniture, the same pictures on the walls. But it felt wrong. I glanced toward the living room. The cabinet stood in the corner, still and silent. The mirror in the back reflected the dim light from the hallway. I turned away. I didn't want to look at it anymore. I was 17, fresh out of my small town, and way too naive for my own good. College was my first real taste of independence, and I hadn't yet learned how dangerous the world could be. That night, I learned the hard way. It was late, past 1 in the morning. I had gone to a friend's dorm earlier in the evening, and we had lost track of time. When I stepped outside, the air was thick and stale, the way it gets in a city after a long, hot day. My dorm wasn't too far, and I figured I could walk back. I told myself it was fine. I didn't know the city well yet, didn't know which parts were safe and which weren't. I thought I'd just follow the main roads and be okay. That was my first mistake. I turned onto a street that should have taken me straight to my dorm, but the further I walked, the worse it looked. The streetlights were busted out, and the ones that still worked flickered weakly, casting sickly yellow light over the cracked pavement. The sidewalk was littered with trash, empty bottles, torn plastic bags, crumpled newspapers that looked like they had been there for weeks. The buildings were old, their windows either boarded up or covered in grime, so thick they barely reflected the light. I could hear people yelling inside some of them, voices raised in anger, the occasional crash of something breaking. I should have turned around, but I didn't. I kept walking, telling myself I just had to get through this one stretch, and I'd be fine. Then I heard the car. At first, it was just the low hum of an engine rolling up behind me, slow, deliberate. I told myself not to look, but I could feel it keeping pace with me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I forced myself to keep walking, acting like I didn't notice, but my heart was hammering in my chest. It was too late to turn around now. I was in the middle of the worst part of the street, alone, with nowhere to go. I stole a glance to the side. The car was an older model, dark, the paint dull under the streetlights. There were 5 men inside. They were watching me. Panic started to creep in, but I told myself to stay calm. Maybe they were just looking for someone. Maybe they would keep going. But they didn't. They stayed with me for nearly a full block, moving at the same speed I was. My mouth was dry, my hands clammy. I felt exposed, completely vulnerable. My legs were weak, but I forced them to keep moving. Up ahead, the street intersected with another. The car pulled ahead just slightly, then made a left turn and stopped. They were waiting for me. My mind went completely blank. I just stood there, frozen, staring at the car parked directly in my path. Every single instinct in my body screamed at me to run. But where? There was nowhere safe. They had a car. If I ran, they'd catch me in seconds. I couldn't go back. There was no one behind me, just darkness and boarded-up buildings. My brain locked up, and all I could do was stand there, trapped in the worst kind of helplessness I had ever felt in my life. Then the porch light flicked on. The house just past the car, one of the only ones that didn't look completely abandoned, suddenly lit up. A man stepped outside, casually holding a bag of trash. He was dressed in old jeans and a hoodie, looking like he had just rolled out of bed. He didn't look at me right away, didn't even seem to notice the car. He just walked toward the trash can at the edge of his porch. The car in front of me roared to life, tires screeching as it peeled away down the street. I felt my knees buckle. My breath hitched, and suddenly I couldn't hold it together anymore. Tears blurred my vision, my entire body shaking as the adrenaline finally caught up to me. I didn't care if I looked like a mess. I had just barely avoided something I didn't even want to think about. The man turned then, finally noticing me. He took a step forward, frowning. I tried to say something, but all that came out was a strangled sob. He didn't press me, just gestured for me to come inside. I hesitated, still shaken, but something about him felt safe. He had just scared off the car without even realizing it. Whoever he was, he had just saved my life. Inside, the apartment was small but warm. His roommate was still awake, sitting on a couch surrounded by papers and a half-eaten sandwich. They both looked at me with concern, but neither of them pushed for answers. The man who had taken out the trash handed me a soda and told me to sit for a minute. I didn't argue. My hands were still shaking as I took a sip, the cold carbonation burning my throat. When I finally managed to stammer out what had happened, they exchanged glances. The guy who had brought me inside just nodded, like he wasn't surprised at all. "This neighborhood's a shithole. his roommate muttered, shaking his head. They didn't let me leave alone. After I calmed down a little, they both walked me all the way back to my dorm. The streets still felt dangerous, but with them beside me, I wasn't scared anymore. I clutched my soda can the entire way like it was some kind of lifeline, still not fully believing how close I had come to something horrible. When we got to my dorm, I thanked them as best as I could. They told me they did stand-up comedy at a bar downtown, invited me to come check it out sometime. I smiled, but I knew I wouldn't be able to. I was too young to get into a bar. I never saw them again after that night. I don't even remember their names. But I do remember that porch light flicking on. I remember the sound of the car speeding away. I remember how different my life could have been if that man hadn't decided to take his trash out at 1 a.m. It was the dumbest decision I had ever made, walking through that part of the city alone at night. I should have known better. I should have taken a cab, called a friend, done anything but what I did. But I was lucky. Incredibly, unbelievably lucky. I don't like to think about what would have happened if I hadn't been. When we first moved into the house I grew up in, I was only 6 years old. It was a one-story ranch-style house, long and narrow, with my bedroom at one end of the hall and my parents' room at the other. The house smelled new when we moved in, like fresh paint and clean wood, but at night, it felt bigger than it should have been. It started within the first few weeks. I would be sitting on the floor in my room, playing with Legos or coloring, or flipping through a book, and I would hear my dad call my name. His voice always came from their bedroom, clear as day. It wasn't muffled, wasn't distorted. It was just my name, like he was expecting me to come right away. I would get up, walk down the hall to my parents' room, and stand in the doorway. My dad would always be sitting on the bed or standing near the dresser, looking at me confused when I asked what he needed. He never called me, he would say. My mom would glance up from her book or whatever she was doing, shake her head, and go back to it like it was nothing. The first couple of times, I assumed maybe I had just imagined it. I was a kid, I had a big imagination. But then it kept happening. Every couple of days, without fail, I'd hear it again. My dad's voice, always calling my name, always coming from their room. And every single time, I'd go ask him what he wanted, and every single time, he'd look at me like I was making it up. After a while, I got frustrated. I was convinced my parents were messing with me, playing some weird joke that didn't make any sense. I didn't tell them that, but I started trying to catch them in the act. I'd walk into the hallway slowly, hoping to hear something else, maybe a laugh, maybe one of them whispering, but it was always just silence. Then one night, it changed. I had been in bed for a while, not quite asleep, but in that space where everything is soft and hazy. I heard my name. It wasn't loud, but it was clear, like someone was standing at the foot of my bed and saying it just loud enough for me to hear. I sat up fast, my chest tight, and listened. Nothing. The house was still. The only sound was the soft hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen down the hall. I told myself I imagined it, laid back down, and pulled the blankets up to my chin. Then I heard it again. It came from my parents' room. I recognized my mom's voice this time. She was calling for me. I threw the blankets off and hurried down the hallway, half expecting to find her standing there waiting for me. But when I stepped into the room, my parents were sitting on the bed, my dad reading something, and my mom watching TV. They looked up, surprised. Before I could even say anything, I heard her voice again. From the living room. I froze. My stomach twisted into knots. I was standing in my parents' room. They were right in front of me. My mom hadn't called me, but I heard her voice. I knew I did. The living room was all the way on the other side of the house, past the kitchen, past the dining room. I stood there, staring at my parents, feeling something I didn't have words for yet. It wasn't fear exactly, not yet. It was something deeper, something I didn't know how to explain. I didn't go to the living room. I turned around and went back to my room, shutting the door behind me. I didn't sleep much that night. After that, I stopped responding when I heard my name. It kept happening, always from somewhere else in the house, always a voice I recognized. Sometimes it was my dad, sometimes my mom, even my brother once or twice. But I never answered. I told myself it was my imagination. I told myself it didn't matter. But the truth was, I hated being alone in the house. Even in the middle of the day, with sunlight pouring through the windows, I hated it. Years later, when my brother was older, he was diagnosed with partial narcolepsy. One of the symptoms we learned was oral hallucinations. That was the first time I had an explanation that made sense, and for a while, I latched onto it. Maybe I had it too. Maybe that was all it was. I got tested. The results came back completely normal. No narcolepsy, no auditory processing issues, nothing. I still hear it when I visit. Every time I spend the night, I wake up at least once to my name being called from the hallway, from the kitchen, from the living room. It never sounds wrong. That's the worst part. It never sounds strange or distorted or anything like what you'd expect from something that isn't real. It always sounds exactly the way it should, and I never answer. I woke up. My heart was pounding, but I wasn't sure why. The room was pitch black, and for a moment, I just lay there, trying to get my bearings. The air was still, heavy, like the quiet that comes after a storm. I turned my head toward the clock on my nightstand, and the red numbers glowed back at me. 3:34 a.m. A strange feeling crawled through my stomach. Something about that number unsettled me, but I couldn't explain why. I listened for a moment, hearing nothing but the faint hum of the refrigerator downstairs. I was about to roll over and go back to sleep when a sound drifted up from below. Rattling. It wasn't loud, but in the silence of the house, it was unmistakable. A light, metallic clinking, followed by a soft scrape. I held my breath and strained to listen, hoping it was just the wind or the house settling. But a few seconds later, I heard it again. Something, or someone, was moving downstairs. I sat up slowly, my body tense. My first instinct was to go to my parents' room. If someone had broken in, they would know what to do. I slipped out of bed as quietly as I could, my bare feet barely making a sound against the carpet. I reached their door, pushing it open gently, but even in the darkness, I could tell something was wrong. The bed was empty. A chill ran down my spine. My parents weren't the type to go anywhere in the middle of the night. They should have been here, asleep. I took a step back, my pulse quickening. My brain scrambled for an explanation, but nothing made sense. Maybe they had gone downstairs because they heard the noise too? Maybe they were checking it out. I turned toward my brother's room. His light was on, which wasn't unusual. He stayed up late all the time. I pushed the door open just enough to peek inside. No one was there. My chest tightened. He was usually glued to his computer at this hour, but now his chair was empty, his bed undisturbed. Something was wrong. My breathing grew shallow as I backed away. The only thing I could think of was the noise downstairs. If my parents and my brother weren't up here, then whoever was downstairs had to be them, right? I crept toward the staircase, my heartbeat hammering in my ears. The railing was cool under my fingers as I peered over the edge. The living room was dark, but the faint glow from the streetlights outside cast long shadows across the floor. I hesitated before taking a step down. The wood creaked under my weight, and I froze, listening. There were two figures in the middle of the living room. My stomach dropped. They were standing near the TV, one of them crouched, yanking at the wires while the other stood guard, glancing toward the stairs. They weren't my parents. They weren't my brother. They were strangers. I turned and bolted back upstairs, my movements fast but quiet. My hands shook as I shut my bedroom door and locked it. My breath came in short, uneven gasps. I stood there, my back pressed against the door, willing myself to disappear. Then suddenly, a loud bang against the wood made me jump. My eyes snapped open. I was in bed. My heart was pounding. My throat was dry. My hands clutched the sheets so tightly my knuckles ached. I took a deep breath, then turned my head toward the clock. 3:34 a.m. A wave of relief washed over me. It was a dream. Just a dream. I let out a shaky exhale, rubbing my face. My body was trembling, but I forced myself to sit up. My mind was still foggy, but I knew what I had to do. I had to get up, go downstairs, and prove to myself that everything was fine. That's how I always shook off bad dreams. By facing them. I swung my legs over the side of the bed and stood. The floor was cold under my feet. I made my way to the hallway, heart still racing but my brain working to convince me that I was being irrational. Everything would be normal. My parents would be in their room. My brother would be on his computer. I would go downstairs, see nothing, and then go back to sleep. I passed my parents' room. The door was open. The bed was empty. I swallowed, pushing down the rising panic. I moved toward my brother's room. His light was on. I pushed the door open. Empty. A cold sweat broke out on the back of my neck. My breath hitched as I turned toward the staircase, my limbs stiff with fear. I took one step down, then another, then another. I reached the bottom and turned toward the kitchen. Two men were standing there. They weren't just stealing. They weren't just sneaking around. They were screaming. At my parents. At my brother. Their voices were loud, furious, filled with rage. My mother was clutching my father's arm, her face pale with terror. My brother stood stiff, frozen in place. One of the men turned his head. I ran. My legs moved before I could even think, carrying me back up the stairs. My breath burned in my throat. I reached my bedroom, slammed the door, locked it, and pressed my back against it. My entire body shook as I squeezed my eyes shut. Then, after 10 agonizing seconds, the banging started. My eyes snapped open. I was in bed. I couldn't move. My body was frozen, every muscle locked in place. My breath came in ragged gasps, my chest rising and falling so fast it hurt. Slowly, I turned my head toward the clock. 3:34 a.m. My body wouldn't stop shaking. My mind was screaming at me to get up, to check, to make sure I was really awake. But I couldn't do it. I couldn't make myself move. What if it wasn't over? What if I got up and it all started again? I lay there, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. My body ached with exhaustion, but I couldn't bring myself to close my eyes. Hours passed. The sun rose. The world outside moved on. But I stayed in bed, too afraid to find out if I was still dreaming. I was sitting at the dining room table, working on my homework, the dull yellow glow of the overhead light casting a small circle of brightness around me. The rest of the house was dark, the way it always was at night. My parents were in their bedroom down the hall, the door closed. My younger siblings had gone to bed already, and I was the only one awake in the main part of the house. The only sound was the faint scratching of my pencil on paper and the occasional rustling of a page as I flipped through my textbook. From where I sat, I had a clear view of the front door. It was an old wooden door with a narrow, vertical pane of glass near the center, about 2 feet wide and 5 feet tall, covered with a thin lace curtain. The curtain didn't do much for privacy. It was meant more for decoration than anything. But at night, with the light on inside and the darkness outside, it was impossible to see past the glass. It always made me uneasy, knowing that anyone standing outside could see in if they got close enough, while I wouldn't be able to see them at all. I was deep into my assignment, half distracted by the numbers in front of me, when I heard it, a noise outside. It wasn't loud, not a knock or anything definite, just a slight rustling sound, something shifting on the porch. My first thought was that it was the wind. The house was old, and the porch creaked sometimes when the wind hit it just right. But as I sat there, pen frozen in my hand, I realized there was no wind. The trees outside weren't moving. Everything was completely still. I lifted my head slowly, my eyes locking onto the front door. Nothing at first, just the dim outline of the curtain covering the glass panel. I told myself I was imagining things, that maybe I had heard something from the TV in my parents' room or from outside in the distance. But just as I was about to look back down at my homework, I saw it. The screen door was opening. It wasn't a quick movement, not like someone yanking it open in a hurry. It was slow, careful, deliberate. I could hear the faint creak of the hinges as it moved, inch by inch. My stomach tightened. My hands went clammy. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. I just watched frozen as the screen door eased open all the way and then stopped. It stayed that way for what felt like forever. Maybe a full minute, maybe longer. I didn't see anyone. The porch light wasn't on, and the outside beyond the glass was just a void of blackness. If someone was there, they were either standing completely still or they were dressed in all black, blending into the night. I should have gotten up. I should have turned on the porch light or called out or done something. But I didn't. I just sat there, gripping my pencil so tightly that it left dents in my fingers, waiting to see what would happen next. Then slowly, the screen door began to close. But it didn't slam shut like it should have if someone had just let go of it. It was being closed carefully, controlled, like someone was making sure it wouldn't make too much noise. I could hear the faint metal-on-metal sound of the latch settling back into place. And then nothing. I stayed completely still, ears straining to hear anything, eyes fixed on the door, waiting for something else to happen. A shadow to move, a figure to step forward, a knock, footsteps. But there was nothing, just silence. I didn't know how long I sat there, barely breathing. I didn't hear footsteps leaving, didn't hear a car door slam, didn't hear anything that would have told me someone had walked away. But at some point, I realized my heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. My hands were shaking. I finally forced myself to move, standing up on unsteady legs and reaching for the light switch that controlled the porch light. I hesitated for a second before flicking it on. The sudden brightness made me blink, my eyes adjusting to the change. But when I finally focused on the porch, it was empty. No one was there. The screen door was shut, still swaying slightly from where it had been moved, but the porch itself was bare. I stepped forward slowly, my breath shallow, and peered through the curtain, trying to see beyond the small circle of light that the porch light cast. The yard, the street beyond it, the sidewalk, everything looked exactly the way it always did. There was no sign of anyone. I didn't open the door. I thought about it for half a second, but the idea of stepping outside, of putting myself on the same side of the door as whatever had just been there, made my stomach twist. Instead, I turned every lock on the door, checking each one twice, then backed away slowly, my heart still hammering. I turned off the dining room light so that I wouldn't be sitting there in full view of the door anymore. My homework was still spread out across the table, but I couldn't focus on it anymore. I kept thinking about that screen door, the way it had moved, the way it had been handled so deliberately, so quietly. The way someone had been standing there, watching, waiting, and then left just as silently as they had come. Eventually, I forced myself to go to bed, but I didn't sleep well. Every little noise outside made me jolt awake. I kept thinking I would hear the screen door again, or that I would wake up to see a shadow standing outside the window. But nothing happened. Morning came, and with the daylight, everything felt less real, like maybe I had imagined it. Maybe I had just been seeing things. But I hadn't. The next day, I checked the screen door in the daylight. There were smudges on the metal handle, fresh ones that hadn't been there before. Not mine. Someone had been there. Someone had stood on my porch, opened my door, waited, and then left when they realized I had seen them. I never figured out who it was, or why they had been there, or what they had planned to do if I hadn't been sitting at the table when they opened that door. But I never sat in that spot at night again. And after that night, we always kept the porch light on. I was driving home late at night, coming back from a family reunion that had run longer than I expected. It was a 2-hour drive, and I had originally planned to stay the night, but work the next morning meant I had no choice but to head home. Most of the drive was through dark, winding roads surrounded by dense trees and thick bushes on both sides. The kind of roads that always show up in horror movies, where headlights barely cut through the darkness, and anything beyond the tree line is just an endless black void. I had been driving for about 45 minutes when I started feeling overwhelmingly tired. It wasn't the slow, creeping exhaustion that builds up over time. It hit me all at once. My eyelids felt heavy, my head started nodding forward, and my vision blurred slightly at the edges. I turned up the music, rolled down the window, and even pinched my arm a few times, but nothing helped. I knew I wasn't going to make it home in this state, but I also hadn't passed a single safe place to pull over. The road was narrow, with no rest stops, no gas stations, not even a wide enough shoulder to feel secure. That was when I made a questionable decision. I spotted a small opening in the bushes and veered off the road, slowly pulling my car into the grass behind the trees. It wasn't much, just a little gap barely wide enough to squeeze through, but it would hide my car from passing drivers. I checked the clock, 11:22 p.m. The night was silent except for the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. It wasn't a good spot, but it was better than nothing. I locked the doors, adjusted my seat, and let exhaustion take over. A sound woke me up, a faint, scratching noise. My eyes snapped open, and for a few seconds, I wasn't sure where I was. Then I remembered. I glanced at the clock, 11:50 p.m. The sound had already stopped, and the car was silent again. Probably just a branch brushing against the metal, or some small animal sniffing around. I was too tired to care. Without giving it another thought, I closed my eyes and drifted back to sleep. The second time I woke up, it was different. The scratching had returned, but it wasn't just a faint noise anymore. It was steady, deliberate, right against the side of the car. I stayed completely still, my breath shallow. Something was outside. The clock read 12:40 a.m. For a long moment, I didn't move. My mind scrambled for an explanation, trying to convince myself it was just another animal. But then I realized something that sent a cold shiver down my spine. If it had been an animal, why would it have come back nearly an hour later? I swallowed hard and slowly moved my hand to the rearview mirror. I angled it just slightly, just enough to get a view behind the car without making any sudden movements. My stomach dropped. I saw something, someone, just at the edge of my vision, a figure darting away into the trees. My body went cold. My first thought was of that old urban legend, the one about the hook-handed killer scratching at a couple's car. My mind screamed at me to start the car and drive, but my limbs felt frozen. I forced myself to breathe, to think. If I turned on my headlights, would I see someone standing there? Would I see nothing at all? I couldn't risk it. I turned the key in the ignition with shaking hands. The engine roared to life, and at that moment, I felt something close to relief. Whatever was out there, I wasn't staying to find out. I pressed the gas, rolling forward, back onto the road, my heart hammering in my chest. I barely made it 100 yards before I saw it. A car parked off to the side of the road, just past a bend. The driver's side door was wide open. I slowed down, my instincts telling me to take a quick look, to make sure no one was hurt or stranded. My headlights illuminated the interior, empty. The seats were bare, no bags, no sign of anyone having been there recently. Just an abandoned car in the middle of nowhere. I glanced at my rearview mirror again, half expecting to see the figure standing behind me watching. But the road was empty. I let out a shaky breath, my grip tightening on the steering wheel. Then movement. My eyes flicked back to the mirror just in time to see someone sprinting around the bend behind me. A man, his arms pumping, his legs moving fast, faster than anyone should be able to run after standing in the dark for who knows how long. And then he screamed, "Hey, hey, get the fuck out of your car. Now." The sound of his voice shot adrenaline straight into my veins. I didn't think. I didn't hesitate. I slammed my foot on the gas and tore down the road. My tires screeched against the pavement as I sped away, the car's engine roaring in the otherwise silent night. I looked in the mirror one last time, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. He was still there, still running, his face contorted in anger, his mouth open as if he was still screaming, but I couldn't hear him anymore. He was falling behind, the distance between us growing, but the way he had moved, the way he had sprinted after me without a second of hesitation, left my blood running ice cold. I didn't stop. I didn't slow down. I didn't dare look back again. I drove straight home, gripping the wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. I ran every red light, ignored every speed limit. My body was shaking, my mind racing with every possible nightmare scenario. What if I had stayed parked just a little longer? What if I had gotten out of the car to check the noise? What if I had stopped to investigate the abandoned vehicle? I got home just before 2 a.m., locked every door and window, and sat in my living room for hours, unable to sleep. Every little noise outside made me jump. Every shadow felt like something lurking just beyond my vision. The next day, I checked the news, searched online for any reports of abandoned cars, missing people, anything that could explain what happened. Nothing. No reports. No incidents. It was as if that night had never happened. But I know what I saw. To this day, I don't know who that man was or what he wanted. I don't know why he was there, in the middle of nowhere, waiting, watching. I don't know if he was the one who had been scratching at my car, or if he had been hoping I would stop when I saw his vehicle. But I do know one thing. I will never, ever pull over on a deserted road again. When I was 13, my grandmother was dying of cancer. It had been a slow decline, stretching across months, then weeks, then days. My mother and I stayed at her house in those final weeks, taking care of her, making sure she was as comfortable as possible. The house smelled like medicine and old wood, and it was always quiet except for the occasional sound of the wind outside or the creaking of the floorboards under our tired footsteps. My grandmother had once been a strong woman, but by then she was bedridden, barely able to move on her own. She had lost so much weight that her bones pressed against her skin, and her voice had become so weak that we had to lean in close just to hear her. The hospice nurse came by during the day, checking on her, adjusting her medication, speaking in that soft, measured tone that people use around the dying. At night, it was just my mother and me, taking turns listening for any change in her breathing, any sign that she was in pain or discomfort. That house had always made me uneasy, even when I was younger. It wasn't haunted or anything like that, but it had that heavy feeling, the kind that settles into the walls of old homes where people have lived and died. The furniture was all old, dark wood, and the house had that musty smell of age and dust, no matter how often it was cleaned. The hallway leading to my grandmother's room was long and narrow, and at night, the darkness seemed to press in on either side. The air always felt a little too still. It was late when I finally fell asleep that night, exhaustion pressing down on me after another long day of sitting by my grandmother's bed, listening to her shallow breaths. My mother had gone to bed earlier, but I had stayed up, reading by the dim light of a lamp until my eyes wouldn't stay open anymore. I don't know how long I had been asleep when my mother suddenly burst into my room. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with something between fear and confusion. She told me that my grandmother had just walked into her room and woken her up. I remember sitting up, still half asleep, trying to make sense of what she was saying. That didn't make any sense. My grandmother hadn't been able to walk in days. She barely had the strength to lift her arms, let alone get out of bed and walk down the hall. But my mother was insistent. She said my grandmother had been standing there in her doorway, then turned and left the room. We ran to my grandmother's bedroom. The door was partially open, and the dim glow from the nightlight cast long shadows along the floor. My mother went in first, hurrying to the bed. My grandmother was lying exactly where we had left her, the blankets pulled up to her chest, her hands resting lightly on top. She wasn't breathing. For a long moment, we just stood there. The room was so quiet. The whole house seemed to have fallen into some kind of deep, unnatural silence. My mother moved first, stepping closer, reaching out to touch my grandmother's hand. It was cold. I remember the way her face changed as the realization set in. I had never seen my mother cry like that before, not the way she did then, silent, almost stunned, as if her body wasn't sure how to react to the weight of it all. The next few hours were a blur. The phone calls, the hushed voices, the arrival of the hospice nurse, and then the funeral home workers who came to take my grandmother's body away. I remember sitting in the living room, feeling hollow, my mind replaying what my mother had said over and over again. My grandmother had walked into her room. She had woken her up, but that was impossible. At the time, it didn't seem important to question it. Grief does strange things to people, and there were more pressing things to deal with. We went through the motions, calling family, making arrangements, sorting through my grandmother's belongings. The days passed in a haze, and soon, the memory of that night became just another part of the story of her passing. Something that we didn't talk about, something that was too strange to dwell on. It wasn't until months later, maybe even years, that I finally asked my mother about it. We were sitting in the kitchen, talking about something unrelated, when I brought it up. I asked her if she remembered waking me up that night, if she still thought she had seen my grandmother walking around the house. She looked at me, genuinely confused. She didn't remember. Not just the part about my grandmother being up. She didn't remember waking me up at all. She had no memory of coming into my room, of telling me that she had seen my grandmother standing in the doorway. She didn't know what had woken her up, or why she had gotten out of bed at all. It didn't make sense. I knew what I had heard. I remembered every detail of that night, the urgency in my mother's voice, the way she had looked when she burst into my room. But she had no recollection of any of it. The more I thought about it, the more unsettling it became. It wasn't just a simple case of misremembering. She truly had no memory of any of it. It was as if something had nudged her awake, pushed her to get up, to check on my grandmother at the exact moment she passed. To this day, I don't know what to make of it. I don't believe in ghosts or anything like that, but something about that night still lingers in the back of my mind. Maybe it was just a strange coincidence, or maybe grief and exhaustion played tricks on both of us. But no matter how much time passes, I can't shake the feeling that there was something else at work that night, something I'll never fully understand. It was still dark when I stepped out of my apartment, the sky just beginning to show the earliest hints of dawn. The air was damp, thick with mist that hung low over the street, swallowing the glow of the streetlights and muffling the few sounds of the early morning. My breath made small, visible puffs in the cool air as I walked, the world still half asleep around me. The only sounds were my own footsteps on the damp pavement and the faint rustling of leaves as a light breeze moved through the trees. I took a bite of my banana, not really tasting it, more focused on the internal debate that had been occupying my mind since I left my apartment. Starbucks before or after the commute. It was such a small, stupid thing to be thinking about, but at 5 in the morning, with my brain still sluggish from sleep, it felt like an important decision. I adjusted the strap of my bag on my shoulder, shifting the weight slightly. The streets were empty, as they usually were at this time. It was too early for most people to be out, aside from the occasional jogger or someone walking their dog. As I approached the intersection near my bus stop, I barely noticed the alleyway to my left. It was a narrow, unlit space between two buildings, the kind of place that never seemed inviting no matter the time of day. It wasn't until a figure stepped out from the shadows that I registered someone was there. A tall man, dressed in black, wearing a mask. I was still too groggy to react immediately. My brain was lagging, struggling to process what I was seeing. My first thought wasn't even fear, it was confusion. The man moved quickly, stepping directly into my path, and before I could even take a step back, he raised his arm. A gun. The sight of it sent a jolt of electricity through my body, snapping me into full awareness. "Put down your fucking purse." His voice was sharp, angry, cutting through the morning quiet like a blade. The gun was pointed at my head. I felt my heart start to hammer in my chest, a cold wave of adrenaline surging through me. "Put down your bags." My hands felt slow and clumsy, but I did as he said, lowering my bag to the sidewalk. Okay, I'm putting them down," I said, my voice shaky. He wasn't satisfied. He pointed toward the alley. "Get down on the fucking ground." My stomach clenched. The alley was dark, empty, hidden. My brain was screaming at me that if I went in there, I wasn't coming back out. "I'm coming, okay." My hands were still sticky with banana. My breath was shallow and fast. I needed to get away. I lowered myself onto the sidewalk, trying to think, trying to calculate. I had to do something. He got on top of me, pressing the gun against my head. I could feel the weight of him, the pressure of the weapon against my skull. My chest was tight, every muscle in my body screaming at me to run, to fight, to do something. Then he hesitated. Something changed. His body tensed, and for a second, I thought he was about to pull the trigger. But then he moved, shifting off me, standing up. His head tilted slightly as he looked at me. It was as if he was seeing me differently now, as if something had just clicked in his mind. And then he pointed toward the alley. "Come with me." I felt like my stomach had been ripped out of my body. Every nerve was on fire, my entire being screaming that this was it. If I went down that alley, it was over. The neighborhood had seen a series of attacks recently. Women dragged off in daylight, assaulted, left broken and afraid. I thought of the news reports, the interviews, the warnings. The voice in my head was crystal clear. No way in hell. But he had a gun. Fucking follow me. My legs felt locked, frozen in place. My mind raced, trying to find an escape. Then instinct took over. I spoke. My mouth moved before I even had a plan. "I'm coming. I'm following you." I stepped forward, just slightly. He turned his body, shifting his focus, and in that moment, I moved. I ran. I ran harder and faster than I ever had in my life. My breath tore from my lungs, my chest burned, my legs screamed in protest. I ducked my head, expecting at any moment to hear the crack of a gunshot, to feel a sharp pain explode in my back. My own voice was in my ears, a high, ragged scream I barely recognized as mine. Block after block flew past in a blur of concrete and streetlights. I didn't stop. I couldn't. I ran until my lungs felt like they would burst, until my vision blurred from exertion. When I finally reached my apartment building, I forced myself to slow down, to stop gasping like an animal. If he had followed me, I couldn't let him see where I lived. I ducked around the corner, pressing myself against the cold brick wall, straining to hear any sign of pursuit. The street was empty, silent. I waited, barely breathing. Then slowly, I crept up to my door, unlocked it with shaking hands, and slipped inside. I locked every bolt behind me and collapsed against the wall. My entire body was trembling, my skin slick with cold sweat. An hour later, the police checked the alley. He was gone. The only thing left was my banana peel, lying there on the pavement, already starting to brown. I didn't sleep for days. Every time I closed my eyes, I was back there, feeling the weight of him, the press of the gun against my skull. My body kept replaying the moment over and over, like it was trying to burn the lesson into my bones. Even now, years later, I think about it. About the what-ifs. What if I had hesitated? What if I hadn't run? What if he had pulled the trigger? Those questions haunt me more than anything that actually happened. But I was lucky. I made it home. And that morning, as the adrenaline finally faded, I realized I never did get my Starbucks. The war had been dragging on for years, and London had become a city of dust and rubble, the air thick with smoke and the constant echo of sirens. Nights were the worst. The darkness brought with it a sense of helplessness, the knowledge that at any moment the world could shatter around you. My mother had learned to live with that fear, as had everyone, but that did not mean it got easier. She had already lost one home. The house she had shared with her family had been bombed out just weeks before, reduced to a broken skeleton of charred wood and collapsed brick. There had been no time to grieve. She had taken what little she could carry and moved in with a friend who lived on the outskirts of the city, where the bombings were still bad, but not as relentless as in the heart of London. She had no other choice. She had a baby to care for, my father, still so small that he barely made a sound when he slept, a tiny, fragile thing wrapped up in whatever warm blankets she had left. The house was an old one, narrow and tall, the kind that seemed to groan with the weight of time. It wasn't much, but it was shelter. The friend had been kind enough to offer the top room, a small space with a single bed and a rickety cot she had managed to set up for the baby. It was better than nothing. After so many nights of hiding in shelters or sleeping wherever they could find a safe corner, a real bed, a door that locked, felt like a gift. That night had been like any other. The air was still heavy with the lingering smell of smoke, the city trembling under the weight of the war. My mother had been exhausted, her body aching from the strain of carrying my father up the stairs, her arms stiff from holding him so close. She had barely reached the landing when she stopped. Something was wrong. The staircase was dim, the only light coming from the candle she held in her free hand. The shadows flickered against the walls, twisting and stretching with each step. It was then, right there in that moment, that she saw it. A figure. It was not a shadow, not a trick of the dim light. It was there, standing in the middle of the stairs, blocking the way. It did not move, did not speak. It simply existed in front of her, silent, unmoving. Her heart slammed against her ribs. She had learned not to trust her own fear. War did that to people, made them see things, imagine things. But this was different. This was real. It was as if the air itself had shifted, thickened, pressing down on her. She did not stay to question it. Every instinct in her body screamed to turn back, to get away from that stairwell, from that room. Without a word, she turned on her heel and hurried back down. She did not stop until she was in the sitting room, her breath coming in short gasps, her arms still wrapped around the baby. Her friend had frowned, confused by the sudden change, irritated even, but my mother had not cared. She refused to go back upstairs. That night, she slept on the floor in the sitting room, my father tucked beside her. She did not know what had driven her to do it. She did not want to think about it. The exhaustion took over, and at some point, she must have fallen asleep. Then the bomb came. The explosion ripped through the night, shaking the ground, shattering windows. The sound was deafening, a force that seemed to split the sky in half. My mother woke to the chaos, the house trembling around her, the screams of the city echoing through the walls. It took her a moment to understand, to process what had happened. Then she remembered. The top room. She stumbled to her feet, nearly tripping over the blankets, her heart hammering against her ribs as she ran towards the stairs. The air was thick with dust, the walls creaking as if the house itself was struggling to hold together. The friend was already ahead of her, her face pale, her hands shaking as she pointed upward. The ceiling had collapsed. The roof of the house, the very top floor, had caved in under the force of the blast. The wooden beams had splintered, the walls crushed under the weight of debris. The room where she was supposed to sleep, where my father's cot had been placed, was now nothing more than rubble. If she had been there, she would have died. The cot was buried under a pile of bricks and broken wood. There was no doubt about it. My father would not have survived. She could barely breathe as she stared at the destruction, at the place where they were supposed to have been, at the space that should have been their last night on Earth. She never spoke about what she had seen on the stairs, not in detail. She never questioned it, never tried to explain it away. She only knew one thing for certain. Something had told her not to go up there. Something had warned her, had pulled her away from death. And that was enough. When I was in nursing school, I had seen many things that would stay with me for life, but one experience stood out among the rest. It was something I could never explain, something that made even the most seasoned doctors and nurses pause. It happened late one night, during my clinical rotations in the ICU. The patient was an elderly woman, frail and thin, with wisps of white hair framing her sunken face. She had been admitted for heart failure, her body struggling against time. She had made her wishes very clear. She did not want to be resuscitated under any circumstances. She had a do not resuscitate order in place, a legal document that we all had to follow. It was what she wanted, what she had chosen for herself. But things changed. As her condition worsened, she became confused, no longer able to communicate her decisions. Her children, who had obtained power of attorney, overrode her wishes. They changed her code status from DNR to full code, meaning we had to do everything in our power to bring her back if she went into cardiac arrest. It was a decision none of us agreed with, but we had no choice. Legally, we had to follow the orders. I remember feeling uneasy about it. She had been so sure, so clear about what she wanted. But now, against her own will, she would be forced to endure whatever interventions were necessary to keep her alive. It was around 2 a.m. when it happened. The monitors beeped erratically, then let out that single, sharp tone, the one every nurse dreads. Ventricular fibrillation. No pulse. No breathing. The room was suddenly a blur of movement. We jumped into action, starting compressions immediately. The code team was called, and within seconds, the room filled with people. Nurses, doctors, the respiratory therapist, all working together in a coordinated effort to bring her back. The doctor called for a shock. We grabbed the defibrillator, positioned the pads, and prepared to deliver the first jolt. The machine was checked every day, every shift, without fail. It had never malfunctioned before. But nothing happened. The machine refused to deliver the shock. The doctor tried again, pressing the button harder this time, frustration creeping into his voice. Still nothing. The defibrillator remained silent, unresponsive. We continued CPR, pushing air into her lungs, forcing blood through her body. Another attempt. Another failure. The machine was dead. The doctor called for a second defibrillator. A nurse sprinted down the hall, returning with another machine. We quickly switched out the equipment, placing fresh pads on her chest. The doctor pressed the button once more. Still nothing. The silence stretched on. The only sounds were the rhythmic counting of compressions, the harsh mechanical hiss of the amber bag, and the beeping monitors charting her decline. We tried again and again. It would not work. And then, just like that, she was gone. The moment her vitals flatlined completely, the machine suddenly sprang to life. The lights flickered on, the screen displayed a functional reading, and the charge indicator was ready. The doctor, the nurses, everyone in the room froze. It had worked the moment she passed away. No one spoke. The weight of what had just happened settled over us like a heavy fog. I felt my stomach twist, my chest tighten. I had seen death before, but this was different. The hospital checked the machine, tested every wire, every connection. There was nothing wrong with it. It should have worked. It had never malfunctioned before, and never did after that night. In the end, she got what she wanted. She had made her decision long before her children had intervened, and somehow, in the end, that decision held. No matter what we did, no matter how hard we tried, she was not meant to come back. I have been a nurse for 20 years now, and I have never seen anything like it again. I don't know how to explain it. Maybe some things simply go beyond our understanding. Maybe, in that moment, the universe balanced itself in a way we couldn't control. But I do know one thing, she was at peace. And in the end, that was all that mattered. I was about 7 or 8 when it happened, and even now, I don't like talking about it. It was late at night, and I had been asleep for a while when a noise woke me up. A banging on my window. It wasn't a loud, frantic knocking, just a steady, rhythmic thud, like something tapping against the glass. At first, I thought it was the wind, maybe a branch scraping against the window. It was the kind of thing you could explain away if you really wanted to. But something about it felt wrong. I shifted in bed, pulling the blanket up to my chin and closing my eyes, willing myself to ignore it. The wind, I told myself. Just the wind. But then I heard it again. A dull, deliberate thud. And after a few seconds, another. My heart was beating faster now, but I didn't move. If I ignored it, maybe it would stop. Maybe I would fall back asleep, and by morning, I would forget about it. Then came the footsteps. At first, they were faint, just soft creaks in the floorboards. My house was old, and I was used to it making noises at night. Houses settle, people always say, and I'd always told myself that was what I was hearing when the walls popped or the floors groaned. But this was different. The steps weren't random. They were steady, slow, pacing. My room was big enough that you could walk in a full circle around my bed, and that's exactly what it sounded like, someone circling me over and over again. I didn't want to believe it. Maybe I was still half asleep, my mind playing tricks on me. Maybe it was my imagination twisting the sounds of the house into something they weren't. But with every creak, I felt the fear settling deeper in my chest. The air in the room felt different, heavier, colder. I slept with the radio on back then. It was something I always did, just a little bit of background noise to keep me from feeling alone in the dark. But in that moment, it only made things worse. A slow, sad song was playing, the kind that sinks into your bones and makes everything feel emptier. I don't remember what song it was, but even now, if I hear it, I feel that same icy dread crawl up my spine. The footsteps didn't stop. Around and around. My breath felt tight in my chest, and I was too scared to move. I told myself I was just imagining things, that I was being ridiculous. But the room was so cold now that I could see my breath. That wasn't normal. That wasn't my imagination. I wanted to call for my parents, but the words wouldn't come out. My mouth was dry, my body frozen in place. I couldn't stay in that bed. I needed to get out of there. I told myself to count to 3, then run. 1. The room felt like it was closing in around me. 2. The footsteps stopped. 3. I threw back the blankets and bolted. I didn't look around the room. I didn't stop to see if there was anything there. I didn't want to know. All I knew was that I had to get to my parents' room. Their door was just down the hall, but in that moment, it felt impossibly far away. I sprinted as fast as I could, but as I passed the open space near the foot of my bed, I felt it. A cold so deep it made my bones ache. A wave of freezing air that wrapped around me like ice water. My breath came out in a thick white cloud, and for a split second, I couldn't move. And then I heard it. A voice. So quiet I almost wasn't sure I had heard it at all. I'm lost. It wasn't loud. It wasn't angry. It wasn't even a whisper. It was just there. Right next to me. Too close. I ran. I ran so fast I barely felt my feet hit the floor. I reached my parents' door, yanked it open, and dove under their bed. I curled into myself, shaking so hard I thought my teeth would shatter, and squeezed my eyes shut. I couldn't cry out. I couldn't tell them what had happened. I just hid there, willing myself to disappear. I don't remember falling asleep, but at some point, exhaustion took over. When I woke up, the sun was coming through the windows, and everything looked normal again. My parents were still asleep, unaware that I had spent the night under their bed. I crawled out slowly, my heart still pounding, and tiptoed back to my room. Nothing was out of place. My blankets were tossed aside from when I had jumped out of bed, but other than that, everything looked exactly as it had the night before. The window was closed. The floor was empty. There were no footprints, no signs that anyone had been there at all. But the air still felt wrong. The radio was off. I knew I had left it on. I never turned it off before falling asleep. I didn't tell my parents what had happened. I don't know why. Maybe I was afraid they wouldn't believe me. Maybe I was afraid they would believe me. Either way, I kept it to myself. I never slept in that room the same way again. Every night, I buried myself under my blankets, my ears straining for any sign of movement. I never heard the voice again, but I always felt like something was there, just waiting. Even now, all these years later, I still get chills when I think about it. When I hear that song, I have to change the station. When the house settles at night, I have to remind myself that it's just the house, just the wind, just my imagination. But some nights, when I wake up suddenly for no reason at all, I still hold my breath and listen, just in case. Growing up, my younger sister had an imaginary friend. Nothing out of the ordinary for a child, but what always unsettled me was how specific she was about this friend. She wasn't just a made-up playmate or a cartoon character. She was always described the same way, an older lady, nice, and with the name E. For a couple of years, E was a constant in my sister's world. She talked to her, played with her, even insisted she had her own space in our shared bedroom. My parents went along with it, as parents do, figuring it was just a phase. Then one day it stopped. My sister never mentioned E again. She moved on to playing with real friends, and we all just kind of forgot about it. Years later, when my sister was about 10, something happened that made me remember E in a way I wish I hadn't. That night, our mom had gotten an emergency call about our grandfather. He was in a nursing home, and things weren't looking good. Without hesitation, she left with my dad, leaving just me and my sister at home. It wasn't the first time we'd been left alone, and we weren't scared. We had each other, and besides, the house was familiar safe. I was on the other end of the house, lost in whatever I was doing, when I heard the radio turn on in our room. Not just turn on, but blast at full volume, then immediately turn down, then off. Silence. A few seconds later, it did it again, on full blast off. Then again. At first, I thought my sister was messing around, flipping the volume dial just to get a reaction out of me. Annoyed, I got up and headed to our room, ready to tell her to knock it off. But when I walked in, I stopped cold. She wasn't at the radio. She wasn't touching anything. She was sitting on the bed, her face drained of color, her eyes fixed on the radio, like she was seeing something I couldn't. I went over to unplug the radio, thinking maybe a short circuit was making it act up, but my hand stopped when I reached for the cord. There was nothing to unplug. No cord. No batteries. It was the only radio in the house, and it had been dead for years. I turned to my sister, trying to figure out what was going on, and she barely moved. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was barely above a whisper. It was E. I saw her. It was E. I didn't know what to do with that. I felt a cold pressure in my chest, like something heavy was sitting on it. My sister had stopped talking about E years ago. Why would she say that now? I could see she wasn't playing around. She was scared, really scared. I grabbed the house phone and called Mom, my hands shaking as I dialed. When she picked up, I barely got the words out, tripping over my own voice as I tried to explain what had just happened. But before I could even finish, I heard the emotion in Mom's voice. Not fear. Sadness. Grandpa had just passed away. The house felt different after that. Maybe it was just in my head, or maybe something had shifted in a way I couldn't explain. But I didn't feel completely alone, even when I was. The air in our shared room felt heavier at night. The shadows stretched just a little too long. A few days later, at the funeral, a relative pulled us aside and handed my sister a picture they had found while going through old things. It was a wedding photo, an old black and white image of a young couple, the kind of picture you expect to see at a funeral. I barely glanced at it before my sister's voice cut through the quiet room. It's E. I turned to look at her, my stomach twisting. She wasn't joking. She wasn't playing. She was staring at the woman in the picture, the same drained expression on her face as the night with the radio. It was our grandmother, the one who had died when our mom was just a child, long before we were born. We lived in the house Mom grew up in, but there were no pictures of our grandmother anywhere. None. When Mom's stepmother moved into the house, she got rid of all of them. My sister had never seen a picture of her before, and yet she knew her. The funeral ended, and life went on. The radio never turned on by itself again. My sister never mentioned E again, but I thought about it more than I wanted to. Sometimes I'd catch my sister staring at old family photos, like she was trying to piece something together. Sometimes I'd wake up in the middle of the night and swear I felt something shift in the room, like the air itself had moved. I don't believe in ghosts, or at least I don't want to. But every now and then, when I think back to that night, when I think about the look on my sister's face when she saw that picture, I wonder if we ever really understand the things we grow up with. Maybe E was never imaginary. Maybe she had always been there, waiting, watching. When I was about 13 years old, our dog ran away. It had happened before. The gate in the backyard wasn't the best. It didn't latch properly unless you made sure to close it all the way. Sometimes, family members were careless. They'd go outside, take the trash out, or just forget, and the gate would be left open. Our dog, ever curious, would find her way out, trotting off into the neighborhood to explore. She never went far. Usually, I'd find her sniffing around the alleys behind houses, drawn by the smell of trash and whatever leftovers people tossed out. The moment she'd see me, her tail would wag. She'd abandon whatever she was investigating, and she'd come bounding straight to me. I'd leash her up, and we'd walk home like nothing had happened. But this time was different. I had gone out as soon as I realized she was missing. The sun was starting to set, casting long shadows over the sidewalks, and a cool breeze had picked up. I wasn't too worried at first. I followed my usual route, checking the alleys, calling her name, listening for the familiar jingling of her collar. But she wasn't in the usual spots. The minutes stretched on, and my worry started creeping higher. I walked farther than I ever had before while looking for her, my heart pounding harder each time I turned a corner and didn't see her. My mind raced with possibilities. Had she wandered too far and gotten lost? Had someone picked her up? Had she run into the road? By the time I had been searching for almost an hour, I was exhausted and on the verge of tears. My neighborhood wasn't bad, but there were places I had never really walked to before. Areas with older rental properties and townhomes, places I didn't recognize well. The further I got from home, the more uncertain I felt, but I couldn't shake the horrible feeling in my gut. I was about to turn around and give up when I caught a glimpse of something, just the slightest bit of movement behind a wooden fence. I stopped, holding my breath, and then I heard it, a short, sharp yip. My stomach dropped. I stepped closer, peering through a gap in the fence. There, in a muddy backyard, was my dog. She was wet and dirty, her fur matted, and she was pulling at a chain attached to a post in the yard. The sight made my blood run cold. She had never gone this far before. And why was she chained up? Who had put her there? She barked again, frantically now, her body straining toward me. I didn't think. I went straight to the front door and rang the bell. My hands were shaking. I could hear voices inside, muffled talking, maybe even arguing, but I couldn't make out what they were saying. I waited. No one answered. I rang again. After what felt like forever, the door cracked open. A man stood there, peering out at me. He was older, maybe in his 50s or 60s, with graying hair and tired eyes. Something about him immediately put me on edge. The way he looked at me, it wasn't the look of someone surprised or relieved to see a kid at their door. It was wary, suspicious. "Yes?" he asked, his voice flat. "My dog," I said, forcing myself to sound calm. "She's in your backyard. I think maybe you found her and brought her in? Thank you for keeping her safe." He didn't respond right away. His eyes flickered to the side, like he was thinking about something. It was a cold, gray afternoon when my dad and I pulled into the Manassas battlefield. The sky was overcast, thick with low-hanging clouds that barely let any light through. A fine mist clung to the fields and the trees, making everything look blurred and distant. There was a damp chill in the air, the kind that seeped into your clothes and made you wish you had brought a thicker jacket. It must have been November, maybe late fall. The trees had already shed most of their leaves, leaving behind skeletal branches that reached out in every direction. My dad parked his truck on a small hill overlooking the battlefield. From where we sat on the tailgate, we had a clear view of a row of old cannons lined up in the distance. They looked frozen in time, like relics of something too far removed to fully understand. We were eating McDonald's, the warmth of the food a small comfort against the cold. The battlefield was quiet, almost unnervingly so. No birds, no wind through the trees, no distant voices. Just stillness, as if the land itself had decided to stop moving for the day. I remember watching the mist roll in waves across the open field, shifting in and out of the trees. It made everything look even more distant, like the cannons were floating in a sea of gray. Then my dad nudged me, his hand gripping my arm. He was looking toward the cannons, his eyes narrowed. I followed his gaze and saw him. A man standing near the cannons, dressed in full Civil War attire. He was still at first, barely visible through the mist, but then he raised an arm and began to wave. It wasn't a normal wave, not a casual greeting. It was deliberate, slow, a beckoning gesture. A come here motion. My dad always carried binoculars in his truck. Without a word, he reached into the cab, grabbed them, and raised them to his eyes. I could see his expression change almost immediately. He lowered the binoculars for a second, rubbed his face, then looked again. His body stiffened as he studied the man. He handed me the binoculars, and I took a closer look. The man was dressed in a Confederate uniform. His jacket was buttoned high, a belt cinched around his waist. His pants were dark, his boots caked in what looked like mud. His hat sat low on his head, casting a shadow over his face. He was standing completely still except for his arm. which continued to move in that slow, deliberate wave. His face, as much as I could make out through the mist, was expressionless. No sign of urgency, no real emotion. Just the motion of his hand, over and over again. My dad assumed there was some kind of reenactment happening, that maybe the man needed help with something. Without hesitation, he hopped down from the tailgate, dusted off his jeans, and started walking toward the cannons. I kept watching through the binoculars, my heart picking up speed for no real reason other than the strange way the man was acting. As my dad got closer, I noticed something odd. The mist seemed to be shifting, thickening in some places, thinning in others. The man never moved from his spot, just kept waving. My dad slowed down when he was about 10 feet away. I could see the hesitation in his posture, the way he straightened up and tilted his head slightly, like he was seeing something that didn't make sense. Then, without warning, he turned on his heel and ran. I had never seen my dad run like that. Not even when he was working on something and accidentally hurt himself. He sprinted back toward me, his boots slamming against the damp ground. I dropped the binoculars, barely able to process what was happening before he reached the truck, grabbed everything off the tailgate, and tossed it into the back. "Get in," he said, his voice low but firm. I didn't ask questions. I climbed into the truck as he slammed the tailgate shut and jumped into the driver's seat. The tires kicked up mud as we sped off, leaving the battlefield behind us. I kept looking back, half expecting to see the man still standing there, still waving. But I saw nothing. Just the cannons, half hidden by the mist. The ride home was silent. My dad's knuckles were white against the steering wheel. I had 1,000 questions, but I knew better than to ask right then. It wasn't until we were almost home that he finally spoke. "He disappeared," he said, his voice quieter than I had ever heard it. I was looking right at him, and he just wasn't there anymore. He shook his head, gripping the wheel tighter. One second he was standing there, the next he was gone. And I felt, he paused, exhaling sharply. I felt the worst feeling in my stomach, like I wasn't supposed to be there, like I had walked into something I wasn't meant to see. He never elaborated beyond that. Over the years, I've asked him about it a few times, but he always reacts the same way. His face tightens, his voice drops, and he says, "I don't know what it was, but I know what I felt." And that's it. From my perspective, he had been standing right next to the man. I had been watching through the binoculars the whole time, and I never saw him disappear. To me, they had both been there, clear as day, until my dad turned and ran. But he swears that's not what happened. He swears the man vanished. Maybe there's some rational explanation. Maybe the mist played tricks on our eyes. Maybe the tension of the battlefield, the weight of its history, did something to us. Maybe we saw someone who was just playing a role, and something about the moment made it feel different. I don't know. But even now, when my dad tells the story, he gets goosebumps. His voice shakes just a little. And that's enough to make me believe that whatever happened that day, it wasn't something either of us will ever understand. When I was little, my parents let me sleep in the living room on weekends. My sister was a light sleeper, and I was the type of kid who loved staying up late, watching Nick at night until my eyelids got too heavy. It felt like such a privilege at the time, having the big open space to myself, curling up under a thick blanket on the couch with the TV flickering in the dark. It was always comforting to know my parents were just down the hall, their door slightly open. Our family dog, Buddy, usually slept at their feet, but sometimes he'd wander out to check on me, curling up by the couch or drinking noisily from his water bowl in the kitchen. It was a routine I loved, something safe and familiar. That night wasn't any different, at least not at first. I had dozed off, probably during some old black and white sitcom, the glow of the TV stretching long shadows across the floor. When I woke up, the room was cold, and everything felt off. It wasn't just that the TV had switched to static, or that the air felt too still. It was something deeper, something that prickled at the back of my neck. I sat up fast, breathing hard, trying to figure out what had yanked me out of sleep. The first thing I noticed was the silence. Even the cicadas outside, which usually droned through the night, were quiet. The only sound came from the old clock on the wall, ticking steadily, its rhythm somehow slower than I remembered. Then I saw it. Through the front window, just beyond our porch, was the tree line. Tall, thick pines stood like dark sentries in the moonlight, and in one of them, perched on a thick branch, was a figure. At first, my brain refused to make sense of it. It was just a shadow, I told myself. A trick of the light. But then it moved. Not swaying like the branches, not shifting with the wind, but deliberate. Controlled. A person. My body locked up. I wanted to believe I was still dreaming, that my eyes were playing tricks on me. But Buddy's reaction shattered that hope. He launched himself at the window, barking like I had never heard before, his hackles raised, his teeth bared. He snarled so hard his whole body shook, his breath fogging up the glass. I didn't wait. I bolted off the couch, heart slamming in my chest, feet barely touching the floor as I sprinted to my parents' room. I stumbled inside, gasping, my words spilling over each other. I tried to explain, pointing toward the window, but I wasn't even sure if what I was saying made sense. My dad didn't hesitate. He was out of bed in an instant, grabbing something, maybe a bat, maybe his hunting rifle, I don't know, and storming out the front door with Buddy. I stayed with my mom, buried in her arms, every nerve in my body telling me that something was very, very wrong. We listened, but there were no shouts, no struggle, no sound of running footsteps. Just the heavy quiet of the trees. When my dad finally came back inside, he shook his head. "Nothing," he said. "No one out there." I didn't sleep on the couch after that. I went straight to my bedroom, the one I shared with my sister. She was groggy and confused when I told her what happened, but I didn't care if she believed me. I just needed to be somewhere safe, somewhere with walls and a door that locked. But I wasn't safe. I don't know how long I laid there, curled up under my blanket, staring at the ceiling. My dad was awake, making rounds through the house, checking the windows. I heard him moving, heard the quiet clink of his coffee mug. I wanted to believe it was over, that whatever I saw was gone. Then I saw the movement outside my window. Slowly, carefully, I turned my head toward the glass. The moon was still bright, casting everything in a pale glow. And standing there, just beyond the fence, was the man. He wasn't up in the trees now. He was closer. Too close. He didn't move like someone sneaking around or trying to break in. He just stood there, watching. And then, in one slow motion, he raised a hand to his lips. A shush signal. My whole body went numb. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move. My brain screamed at me to do something, to wake my sister, to scream for my dad, but all I could do was stare as he turned and walked away. He didn't run. He didn't try to hide. He just moved in a straight line back toward the trees, disappearing into the darkness. The moment he was gone, I crumbled. My body shook with silent, gasping sobs, tears streaming down my face. I don't know how long I laid there, gripping the blanket so tight my fingers ached. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted into a restless, miserable sleep. By morning, I told my parents everything. My dad checked outside, looking for footprints, for anything that might prove I wasn't crazy. He found nothing. No broken branches, no disturbed grass. No signs that anyone had been there at all. But I knew what I saw. I never slept in the living room again. I never stayed up late alone again. And for months, even years, I hated looking out windows at night. Because even though the man had disappeared into the trees, I never stopped feeling like he was still out there. Watching. Waiting. When I was 8, my family moved from urban South Florida to a tiny town in North Florida. It was the kind of place that felt like it had been frozen in time. Everything about it was different from what I had known before. The streets were empty by sundown. The houses had wide yards with big, old trees that stretched their limbs over cracked driveways, and the silence at night was deep and heavy. It was the kind of quiet that made you hear things you weren't sure were there. In the 15 years since we moved there, a lot of strange things have happened. Some were just small things, moments that made you stop and wonder if you had imagined them. Others were harder to ignore. But the strangest thing, the one I still think about more than anything else, happened when my sister moved back in with my parents. My sister's husband was deployed to Afghanistan, leaving her alone with a newborn baby. She had been living in a trailer out in the woods, but the isolation was unbearable. She couldn't stand the silence, the long nights with only her baby's cries to fill the empty space. So she moved back into my parents' house, into her old bedroom, hoping for comfort, hoping for help. At first, it was just small things. She told us that the headboard of her bed would slam against the wall randomly. Not like it was loose or shaking on its own, but like someone had grabbed it and forced it back. Sometimes, it was loud enough to wake her up. Other times, it happened when she was already awake, lying there in the dark, listening to her baby's soft breathing beside her. She would turn on the light, expecting to see something, but there was never anything there. One night, she woke up because someone was tickling her. She felt the light pressure on her arm, the unmistakable sensation of fingers brushing against her skin. She swatted at it, assuming it was a bug, but there was nothing. She sat up, trying to shake off the grogginess of sleep, her heart pounding harder than it should have been. It was the kind of feeling you get when you know you're not alone, even when you can't see anything. She didn't think much of it at first. Maybe it was just the stress, the exhaustion of taking care of a newborn. She convinced herself it was nothing, until the night she woke up screaming. My mom heard it from down the hall. It wasn't just a startled scream. It was raw, full of fear, the kind of sound that makes your stomach drop. My mom rushed into the room, flipping on the light, and that's when she saw it. The whole bed was shaking. Not just trembling, not just a slight movement. It was rocking violently, slamming up and down, side to side, like a boat caught in a storm. My sister was frozen, gripping the mattress, her baby still sleeping beside her, completely untouched by whatever was happening. The entire room felt wrong. The air was heavy, thick with something unseen, something pressing down on them. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The bed went still. The room was silent again, except for my sister's ragged breathing. My mom stood there for a moment, trying to process what she had just seen. There was no explanation. The bed wasn't broken. There was no reason for it to have moved like that. And yet it had. Things didn't stop after that. If anything, they got worse. My sister was exhausted, stretched thin between taking care of her baby and whatever was happening in that room. But she wasn't the kind of person to just leave. She stayed, determined to push through it, to act like it wasn't real. Then one night, something grabbed her hair. She was sitting on the bed, nursing her son, half asleep but still aware enough to feel it when it happened. A sharp, sudden yank on her ponytail, pulling her head back so hard that she almost lost her balance. It wasn't gentle. It wasn't playful. It was forceful, deliberate. She gasped, her hand flying to her head, expecting to feel fingers still gripping her hair, but there was nothing. Just the lingering sting where it had been pulled. She didn't move. She didn't even turn her head. She just sat there, listening, waiting, barely even breathing. Then my mom came in. She had heard something, maybe a noise, maybe just an instinct telling her to check. She saw my sister sitting there, her body stiff, her face pale. My mom looked around the room, at the quiet, still air, at the baby sleeping peacefully. And then she spoke. It wasn't a scream. It wasn't panicked. It was firm, calm, controlled. Like she was talking to a child throwing a tantrum. She stood in the middle of the room, and she told it to stop. She told it that she understood. That things were different now. That there was a baby in the house, and there had never been one before. That maybe it was curious. Maybe it wanted to see, to understand. But she made one thing clear. It was not allowed to touch them. It could look. It could stay. It had been there before us, and it could remain. But it was not allowed to touch them. And after that, it stopped. The bed didn't shake again. The headboard didn't slam against the wall. My sister never felt fingers brushing against her skin in the night. Whatever had been there, whatever had been watching, seemed to understand the boundary that had been set. My sister stayed in that room until her husband came back from deployment. She left, taking her baby with her, moving into a new house, starting over. But even now, years later, when she talks about it, there's something in her voice that tells me she doesn't like to think about it too much. The room is still there. My parents still live in that house. And sometimes when I visit, I pass by the doorway and feel that same heavy silence, that same strange stillness. Nothing ever happened again, not like it did with my sister. But I still wonder. I still think about that bed shaking, about the fingers on her arm, about the unseen presence that had been there long before we moved in. Maybe it just wanted to be acknowledged. Maybe it just needed to be told the rules. Or maybe it's still there waiting, watching, just staying quiet for now. The first time I really heard it, I thought maybe I had imagined it. But that wasn't true. I had heard it, and I've heard it every time I've stayed here since. I was 14 when my grandparents decided to start sleeping in separate bedrooms. That was when they moved me out of my usual room and into another one on the first floor, directly below the long, narrow bedroom upstairs that I had always been afraid of. I never had a reason for the fear, not really. I had never seen anything, never heard anything, until then. But even as a little kid, I avoided going up there alone. If I had to, I would run up, grab whatever I needed, and run back down, heart pounding like I had barely escaped something. Even now, at 23, I won't go up alone. That night, I lay in bed, trying to fall asleep. The house was quiet, the way it always was after everyone had gone to bed. The only light in the house came from the digital clock on the nightstand and the faint glow from outside creeping through the curtains. I wasn't thinking about anything in particular, just staring at the ceiling, when I heard it. Thump. A slow, deliberate footstep above me. Then another. Thump. Thump. The steps started on one end of the room upstairs, moving at an even, casual pace. Step by step, they came closer, passing directly over me, then continued to the other end of the room where they stopped. My entire body went rigid. I wasn't breathing. I wasn't blinking. I just lay there, listening, waiting for something else to happen. The house was old, but I knew its sounds. I had spent my whole life in and out of it. I had slept here 100 times before, and I knew what regular creaks and groans sounded like. This wasn't that. This was walking, a human weight shifting with each step. It was undeniable. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. My heart thudded so loudly I thought it might drown out the next noise. But then nothing. Just silence. The kind that stretches on for too long, turning seconds into something that feels unnatural. The kind that makes your skin crawl. I threw the blankets off and bolted down the hall to my grandpa's room. I didn't even knock, just opened the door and blurted out what I'd heard. He barely stirred, only mumbling something about how the house creaks, how it settles at night. He got up long enough to turn on the dining room light for me, telling me it'd help me feel better. It didn't, but I went back to my room anyway, because what else was I supposed to do? I climbed back into bed, still tense, still on edge. The light from the dining room reached just far enough to cast a faint glow into my room. I stared at the doorway, my mind running through every logical explanation I could think of. None of them made sense. I tried to tell myself I had imagined it, that maybe I had drifted off and dreamed it, but I knew I hadn't. Then it started again. Thump. But this time, it wasn't at the beginning of the room. It was at the opposite end, by the window, right where it had stopped before. Thump. Thump. The same slow, steady footsteps moving across the floor above me, passing directly over me again, heading toward the door of the room upstairs. And then they stopped. I held my breath, gripping the blanket so tightly my knuckles ached. My chest felt tight, and my body was so tense I thought I might snap in half. I counted the seconds in my head. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Then I heard the stairs. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Silence as it reached the landing. 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Then nothing. I squeezed my eyes shut. My body felt like stone. I couldn't move, couldn't even think past the pounding in my chest. It was downstairs now. It was on my floor. I stared at the open doorway, at the dim glow from the dining room light, afraid to blink, afraid to look away. The air in the room felt heavier, thicker, pressing down on me. My vision wavered, distorted like the room was bending in on itself. My ears were ringing. I wanted to run again, but I couldn't. My body wouldn't cooperate. Then I heard the scratching. A long, slow scrape against wood. It was coming from inside my room. I knew exactly where. My grandpa's gun case. The sound was unmistakable, fingernails dragging down the wooden door, pausing, then starting again. With each scratch, the door gave a tiny tap against the frame. I opened my mouth to scream, but nothing came out. My throat locked up, and I thought I was going to pass out. I forced in a deep breath, and the second I could, I let out a scream so loud it ripped through the silence. My grandpa was there within seconds, standing in the doorway, squinting at me in the dim light. He looked tired, confused, barely awake. But he didn't hear it. He didn't hear anything. I could tell by the way he looked at me. I couldn't sleep after that. I dragged the blanket off the bed and onto the floor, lying underneath it like a shield. I put on headphones, turned my back to the door, and did everything I could to pretend I wasn't there. The next morning, my grandpa told my grandma about what happened. She brushed it off, but then she mentioned something else. "Oh, that's silly," she said. "You know, your cousin woke me up the last time she stayed here." She came into my room saying, "I hear footsteps." That was the last night I ever slept on top of the bed at my grandparents' house. For the rest of my stay that week, I slept under it. I've stayed there countless times since. I hear the footsteps every time. I don't try to convince anyone anymore. I just sleep with my back to the door, headphones in, blanket over my head. And I haven't heard it come down the stairs again. But if it does, I don't want to know. It was a few years ago when I found him. I hadn't planned to be out in the woods for long. I just wanted some air, a quiet walk away from everything, where I wouldn't run into anyone, where I could just think. The trail I usually took was getting too familiar, and I figured I'd go off track a little. Nothing too wild, just enough to see something new. It wasn't supposed to be a big deal. It was late afternoon, the light starting to stretch thinner through the trees. I remember that because I was thinking about whether I should start heading back. It wasn't dark yet, but I wasn't sure exactly how far I'd wandered, and I didn't want to get turned around in the dark. That's when I smelled it. It was thick in the air, that sickly sweet rot. At first, I thought maybe an animal had died nearby. That happens sometimes. A deer, maybe. I hesitated, but curiosity got the better of me. I pushed through the undergrowth, stepping carefully over the tangle of roots and dry leaves. The smell got stronger. Then I saw him. At first, my brain didn't quite register what I was looking at. Just shapes, dark and bloated in the dimming light. My stomach dropped. The body was lying there, half covered by leaves and branches, like nature was already trying to reclaim him. His skin had turned that awful mix of green and black, swollen tight in some places, splitting open in others. His hands were curled up near his chest, fingers stiff and clawed. His face, Christ, his face, was barely recognizable, more like something out of a nightmare than a man. His mouth was slightly open, teeth too white against the decay, and his eyes, though shriveled and sunken, seemed like they were still looking somewhere, seeing something. The insects had found him first. So had the animals. I stumbled back, gagging, trying to breathe through my mouth, but the smell was everywhere. It clung to the inside of my nose, thick and inescapable. My hands were shaking as I fumbled for my phone. My fingers felt numb. I had to force myself to dial. When the police answered, my voice came out thin and unsteady. I told them what I had found, where I was, and they told me to stay put. Stay with him. I didn't want to, but I understood. It wasn't like I could just walk away and expect them to find the exact spot in the middle of nowhere. So I stayed. It got dark faster than I thought it would. The trees pressed in close, and the shadows between them deepened. I couldn't see much beyond a few feet. I didn't want to look at him, but I couldn't help it. Every time I tried to stare at the ground or at the trees, my eyes would drift back, drawn to the horrible stillness of him. The quiet out there wasn't like the quiet at home. It wasn't peaceful. It was too big, too empty. Every little crackle in the leaves made my skin crawl. It felt like something was watching. I kept checking my phone, but there was no service. No messages. Just me, alone with the dead man. The hours stretched out. I shifted, trying to keep from thinking about him, but it was impossible. I kept imagining what he had looked like before, how he had gotten here, how he had died. And then the thought hit me, if he had killed himself, where was the weapon? There was no gun, no rope, no bottle. Just him. I didn't want to think about what that meant. I tried to focus on other things, like listening for the sound of sirens, but all I could hear was the distant rustling of leaves and the occasional snap of a branch somewhere in the dark. Every time I heard something, my body would go rigid, waiting. But nothing came. Eventually, I saw a faint glow between the trees, flashlights. Voices. The relief that hit me was overwhelming. I stood up too fast, my legs unsteady beneath me. I waved them down, calling out. The police pushed through the undergrowth, their faces unreadable as they took in the scene. One of them muttered something under his breath, and another turned away for a second, probably trying not to gag. Even they weren't used to seeing something like this. They asked me questions. How I found him, when if I had touched anything. I answered as best I could. One of them stayed with me while the others examined the body. He was calm, professional, but I could tell he wanted to get this over with as much as I did. Eventually, they told me I could go, that they'd be in touch if they needed more information. I didn't ask what they thought had happened. I didn't want to know any more than I already did. For weeks after, I couldn't get the image of him out of my head. It was burned into me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face. I smelled that smell. Sleep became a battle. When I did manage to drift off, he was there. Not just in the way that memories linger. He was in my dreams. I'd see him standing at the edge of the woods, half hidden in the trees. I'd feel him behind me, close enough that I could sense the weight of him. Sometimes he was exactly as I had found him, bloated and decayed. Other times he looked normal, alive, but his eyes were wrong, filled with something I didn't want to understand. I tried to tell myself it was just my brain processing trauma, that it would pass. But the dreams didn't stop, and in them he was angry. Not in a loud way, not in a screaming, violent way. It was worse than that. He was quiet, just staring, watching, waiting, and I always woke up feeling like I had done something wrong, like I had disturbed something I shouldn't have. I don't walk in the woods much anymore. Not alone, anyway. The idea of wandering off trail makes my skin crawl. Maybe it's stupid. Maybe it really was just my imagination, my brain twisting the experience into something worse. But even now, every once in a while, I still dream about him. And I know I always will. The day started early, like they all did when I was making deliveries. I was on my way to a job site in a fancy gated community near Branson, Missouri, hauling a 900-pound hot tub. These types of deliveries were always tricky, but I had done it enough times that I didn't think much of it. When I arrived, the house was still under construction. The contractor wasn't there, just the workers who were assigned to help me get the tub into place. The house itself was built on the side of a hill. From the driveway, it looked like a normal house, but the backside dropped off into a steep 4-story fall. The 4th floor was the main entrance, and the other 3 levels were built below it, cascading down the hill. The deck where the hot tub was supposed to go was technically on the 4th floor, but in reality, it was a 4-story drop from the far edge. The problem was that the deck wasn't finished. There were huge gaps in the boards, and the only planks installed were the ones leading from the patio doors to the corner where the hot tub would sit. There were no railings, nothing to stop a person from going over the edge. I took a moment to assess the situation. The only way to get the hot tub in place was to move it down into the yard, build a ramp up onto the porch, take it through the living room, out onto the deck, and maneuver it into the corner. I'd done difficult deliveries before, but this one was one of the worst setups I'd ever seen. Still, I had a job to do, and the workers seemed willing to help. We got the tub onto the dolly and started the process. It was slow work, but I was used to it. Moving a 900-pound hot tub takes patience, precision, and teamwork. We managed to roll it down into the yard, push it up the makeshift ramp, and get it through the living room without any major issues. The real challenge came when we had to take it out onto the deck. The narrow planks leading to the corner were just wide enough for the dolly to roll on, but there was no room for error. One wrong move, and the hot tub, or one of us, could go over the edge. We moved carefully, step by step, inching it toward the corner. The weight of the tub made every movement feel heavy, like any small mistake could send the whole thing tumbling. My muscles were tight, my grip locked onto the dolly handle. We finally reached the spot where it would sit, but then the contractor made a last-minute decision. He wanted it left standing on its edge rather than laid flat. This wasn't a new request, but it made the job harder. Normally, I would tilt the tub onto my lap, control its descent, remove the dolly, and set it down carefully. But leaving it standing meant that the dolly had to be pulled out from underneath while the tub remained upright. I explained that we needed to prop up one side with blocks, lean the tub slightly, and release the dolly before tilting it back into position. The problem was that the deck wasn't wide enough for me to do this comfortably. I had just a few inches of space to work with before the edge of the deck, and below that was nothing but open air and jagged rocks 4 stories down. I felt my pulse quicken, but I had done dangerous setups before. I had no choice but to trust the process. We got the blocks in place, and I started to tilt the hot tub. My feet were positioned just 4 inches from the drop. I told the workers to hold still. Any sudden movement could send me over the edge. The dolly was almost free when one of the workers got impatient. He kicked the corner of the tub to speed up the process. In that instant, everything fell apart. The force of the kick shifted the weight of the tub, and I lost my footing. I felt my balance go as my heels slipped off the deck. My arms flailed as I tried to catch myself, but there was nothing to grab. I saw the jagged boulders far below, waiting to break every bone in my body. The air rushed around me. My stomach dropped. I was falling. Panic surged through me. There was nothing I could do, no time to react. My body leaned backward, gravity taking over. But then, suddenly, something slammed into my lower back. Instead of falling into open air, I was yanked forward, my body colliding with the side of the hot tub. My breath shot out of me, and I barely registered what had happened before the workers pulled the dolly free and set the tub upright with me still clinging to it. For a moment, I just stood there, gripping the tub, my body shaking. It took a few seconds to register that I was still alive, still on the deck. My heart was hammering against my ribs, my arms trembling from the rush of adrenaline. Then I saw it, the strap. The same strap that was meant to secure the tub to the house had been behind me. The worker who had been messing with it had already attached one end. When I fell, the strap caught me, and he had pulled it tight just in time. If he hadn't done that, I would have gone over the edge, and I wouldn't be standing there breathing. I would have been broken on the rocks below. I turned to look at him, still gripping the tub. He was just standing there, eyes wide, still holding the strap in his hands. He had no idea that he had just saved my life. I barely had words, just a breathless nod of thanks. My legs felt weak, my entire body trembling from the near miss. I had been seconds away from death, and I knew it. When the job was finally done, I couldn't shake what had happened. The whole drive home, I kept seeing the rocks below, feeling the weightless drop of falling. That worker, who had barely been paying attention, had just saved my life with something that wasn't even meant for that purpose. He had no way of knowing, but without that strap, I wouldn't have been there to thank him. I thought about it for days afterward, thought about what could have happened. I knew I owed him more than just a thanks. He had given me something I could never repay, my life. I had been saving up for a vacation for my wife and daughter, planning to surprise them with a trip to Breckenridge, Colorado. But after what happened, I made a different decision. I gave that vacation to him instead. I sent him, his wife, and his kid to Colorado for Christmas. I never told my wife and daughter about the trip I had planned. They never knew it was supposed to be ours. But I knew what was right. That man had saved my life. The least I could do was give him a trip he would never forget. It was a moment I would never forget either. And every time I step onto a deck, every time I get close to an edge, I remember how close I came to dying that day, and how one simple strap, one random decision, made all the difference in the world. When I was about 7 years old, my two older brothers and I spent a lot of time playing in an area that was used as an unofficial motocross track. It was a place where people would bring their dirt bikes to ride, and over time, the land had been shaped by the constant use. There were ramps, deep tire tracks, and loose dirt everywhere. It wasn't a proper track with safety barriers or anything like that, just an open piece of land that had been repurposed by whoever felt like riding there. To us, it was just another playground. One day, for reasons I can't even remember, we decided to dig a tunnel. Maybe we had seen it in a movie. Maybe it was just one of those dumb ideas kids come up with on the spot. Either way, we thought it was a great plan. My brothers and I spent hours digging into the side of a dirt mound. The soil was loose and dry, easy to scoop away with our hands and whatever makeshift tools we found lying around, sticks, a broken plastic shovel, and our own fingers clawing through the earth. We worked tirelessly, taking turns widening the space, pushing the dirt behind us, making what we thought was an impressive little tunnel. It was about 6 feet deep and just tall enough to crawl inside. It wasn't anything close to structurally sound, but at that age, we had no understanding of that. I was the smallest of the three, so I was the one who fit inside the tunnel the best. It was tight, but I could shuffle forward with my arms bent near my chest, pushing dirt out of the way, feeling the coolness of the packed earth against my skin. I remember being proud of what we had built. It felt like an accomplishment, like we had made something incredible. I wanted to dig deeper, to see how far we could go. My brother stood outside, watching, while I pushed further into the tunnel. Then, without warning, everything changed. There was a deep, heavy shift above me, a sudden feeling of movement in the earth. Before I could even process what was happening, the walls caved in. It wasn't a slow trickle of dirt. It was instant, all-encompassing, a complete collapse. The air was sucked away, replaced with the crushing weight of soil. One moment I was crawling forward, the next I was swallowed whole. My world went black. The first thing I noticed was the heat. It wasn't just warm. It was suffocating, furnace-like, an oppressive weight pressing in from all sides. The dirt packed tightly against my body, against my face, filling every gap, pressing into my mouth and nose. I couldn't move, not even a little. I tried to lift my arms, to push the dirt away from my face, but nothing happened. My body was completely immobilized. The more I tried to move, the more it seemed to press in. Then came the panic. I couldn't see anything. I couldn't breathe properly. The air around me was thick, filled with dust, making every breath feel like I was inhaling sand. My chest struggled to expand, every breath shallower than the last. I tried to scream, but no sound came out, just a muffled, useless noise swallowed by the weight of the dirt. It didn't take long before I started choking, coughing, making it even harder to breathe. My stomach convulsed, my lungs burned, and I felt myself sucking in more dirt, my body betraying me as I struggled to get air. My vision, or whatever you could call it in the pitch black, began turning red, pressure building in my head. I didn't know why at the time, but now I realize it was probably blood rushing to my face from the compression. The heat, the darkness, the pressure, it all made my young mind jump to one horrifying conclusion. I was in hell. I was dying, and this was it. I had done something wrong, and now I was being punished. The pain, the fire-like heat, the weight crushing me from all sides. It was everything I had been told to fear in Sunday school, and now I was living it. The thought consumed me, filling every last bit of my mind. I don't know how long I was buried. It could have been a minute, or it could have been 10. Time lost all meaning in that suffocating void. The only thing I could do was wait. Every second stretched endlessly, my lungs fighting for breath, my mind screaming in terror. My body felt like it was getting heavier, like I was sinking deeper into the ground. It was a sensation I can't fully describe, like being held down by an invisible force, like drowning without water. Then, just as suddenly as it happened, something changed. I felt something grab my foot. It wasn't soft or gentle. It was frantic, urgent, yanking at me with all its strength. My brothers. They were digging, pulling, trying to get me out. I could feel the dirt shifting around me, the pressure easing slightly as their hands tore through the soil. I couldn't move, but I knew they were there. They weren't giving up. The weight lessened a little at a time, and suddenly, light. I didn't even realize my eyes were open until I saw it. Blinding at first, the daylight piercing through the layers of dirt as my brothers pulled me free. Air rushed into my lungs, my body convulsing as I gasped for breath. I coughed violently, dirt spilling from my mouth, my body shaking uncontrollably. I was drenched in sweat, my clothes clinging to me, my skin coated in dust and grime. My brothers were yelling something, but I couldn't process the words. I was too focused on the feeling of air in my lungs, of being free. I don't remember how long I lay there, gasping, trembling, feeling the ground beneath me as something real and solid rather than a crushing prison. My brothers looked shaken but relieved, dirt smeared across their faces and arms from digging me out. They didn't say anything about what had just happened. They just stood there, breathing hard, watching me. We never told our parents. Maybe it was because we didn't want to get in trouble, or maybe it was because we didn't want to admit how close it had been. Instead, we just went home. My clothes were ruined, caked in dirt and sweat, so I stood outside while one of my brothers hosed me down. The water was cold, shocking against my overheated skin, washing away the last traces of dirt, but doing nothing to erase what had happened. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, feeling the ghost of the dirt pressing against me. I could still taste it in my mouth, feel it in my lungs. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw nothing but blackness, felt nothing but heat and pressure. I didn't sleep much that night. We never went back to dig another tunnel. My house sits farther back in the lot than most other houses. It's an odd layout. The sidewalk runs along the entire length of the living room and ends at the front porch, which leads directly into the living room. The house has these large windows that don't open, which let in great light during the day, but at the cost of no privacy. If you were standing outside, you could see straight in. At night, with the lights on, anyone could watch me from the darkness while remaining unseen. The rest of my family was on vacation, leaving me alone in the house. It was the first time in a long while that I had the entire place to myself. I decided I was going to take advantage of it and get completely smashed. There was something about being alone in a house like mine, though, that always made me uneasy. It wasn't haunted, nothing strange had ever happened before, but the layout, the way it sat back from the road, the way the trees crowded around it, all of it made me feel exposed. Still, I drank, and by 9 I was done. I stumbled to the couch in the living room. too drunk and too nervous to make the walk back to my bedroom. I told myself I'd go in a bit, but I passed out almost immediately. I woke up suddenly, but I didn't know why. I just knew I was awake, and I was freezing. The room felt colder than it should have, and I had the worst case of chills I'd ever experienced. My body was tense, my breathing shallow, and I wasn't sure why. I stayed still, listening. Then the banging started. It came from directly above me. The window. The big one. I didn't move, but my eyes shot open, staring up at the glass. Someone was there, standing right outside, pounding on the glass. The first thing I did was glance at the cable box across the room. 3 a.m. The pounding continued, steady and deliberate. It wasn't a knock. It wasn't someone trying to get my attention. It was violent, insistent, as if whoever was out there wanted in. I didn't move. I barely breathed. I just stared up at the window, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The figure was large, but the outside light didn't illuminate them enough to make out details. Just a dark shape, a person standing inches away, separated only by the glass. Then it stopped. I still didn't move. I couldn't. My body was frozen in place. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. Maybe it was a prank. Maybe someone I knew had found out I was alone and was trying to scare me. Then it started again, but not just from the window. Another sound. The front door. A second set of bangs, just as forceful, just as deliberate. One person at the window, another at the door. I was trapped. I wanted to move, to get up, to do something, but I couldn't. My body refused to respond. My mind screamed at me to get up, to hide, to grab something to defend myself, but I just lay there, paralyzed by fear. The banging kept going. The window, the door, the window, the door, over and over. No voices, no demands, just pounding. It went on for what felt like forever. I kept waiting for it to stop, but it didn't. I didn't know what they wanted. They weren't trying to break in. They weren't trying to get a reaction out of me. It felt like they just wanted me to know they were there, that they could get to me if they wanted to. 40 minutes passed. Then suddenly silence. I lay there, still frozen, waiting for it to start again. But it didn't. No footsteps. No laughter. No retreating sounds. Just quiet. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I stayed on that couch, barely breathing, my ears straining for any sound at all. Every time I thought about moving, about getting up to check the locks, to make sure they were really gone, I couldn't. I was too afraid that if I moved, it would start again. When the sun finally started to rise, I forced myself to get up. My legs were weak, my body stiff. I checked the window first. No footprints. Nothing. As if no one had been there at all. The door was still locked. No scratches, no signs of forced entry. But I knew what I had heard. I knew what I had seen. I called a friend later that morning, asked if he'd come stay the rest of the week. He laughed at me, told me he wasn't going to risk getting murdered too. I kept the blinds shut for the rest of the time I was alone. I kept a bat next to the couch. I kept every door locked, every light on. The next night, nothing happened. Or the night after. Or the night after that. But I never slept right in that house again. It was a warm summer night, the kind where the air feels thick, but still carries a little bit of a breeze if you move fast enough. My friend and I had decided earlier that day to go for a late-night bike ride, something we'd done a few times before when the city felt quieter, the streets emptier, and everything seemed a little more peaceful. It was almost midnight by the time we finally decided to call it a night. We rode together until we reached the spot where we had to split off, my friend heading toward their street, while I continued on alone. It was only a few blocks back to my place, nothing I hadn't done before. The roads were mostly empty, a few parked cars here and there, the occasional street lamp buzzing overhead. I had to ride on the sidewalk because of some construction further down, but I wasn't worried. The whole area was still almost too quiet, but I figured it was just because it was late. As I approached the turn onto my street, I noticed a man walking ahead of me. He wasn't particularly out of place, maybe in his 40s, a little scruffy, but nothing that immediately set off alarm bells. He didn't seem homeless, just a little unkempt, the way some people are when they're between jobs or just don't care much about appearances. The sidewalk was narrow, and I didn't want to startle him, so when I got close enough, I called out just a simple "Hey, behind you," so he wouldn't be caught off guard when I passed. The reaction I got wasn't what I expected. He turned around fast, and the look he gave me was pure rage. His eyes locked onto mine, and for a second, I felt like I'd made some huge mistake, like I'd somehow set something off in him. I didn't say anything else, just kept pedaling, turning onto my street without looking back. Then I heard it, screaming. Not just yelling, full-on, rage-fueled screaming. I didn't catch every word at first, but then it got clearer. He was calling me names, every slur and insult you could think of, his voice raw and full of something I didn't understand. And then I heard him say he was going to kill me. I kept pedaling, trying not to make it obvious that I was freaking out. My house was right there, just off the corner, but I didn't want to go home. I didn't want him to see where I lived, to know which door I'd walk through. I made a split-second decision to keep going, to loop around the block instead of stopping. Maybe he'd lose interest, maybe he'd just keep walking, and I could go home once I was sure he was gone. The ride around the block felt longer than it should have. Every shadow felt like it was moving, every parked car like someone was waiting behind it. I kept checking over my shoulder, but he wasn't behind me anymore. The screaming had stopped, and I wanted to believe that was a good sign. But when I finally made it back to the corner and glanced down my street, my stomach dropped. He was standing on my front stoop, just standing there. Not knocking, not moving, just staring out at the street like he was waiting for something. Like he was waiting for me. I didn't slow down. I didn't look for too long. I just kept going, heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. My mind was racing. How did he know? Had he just guessed? Had he followed me before and I never noticed? I had no answers, just the growing realization that I couldn't go home. Not yet. I went straight back to my friend's place. I didn't explain everything right away, just said something weird happened, and I didn't feel safe going home alone. They didn't ask too many questions, just let me crash for the night. I kept checking my phone, thinking maybe he'd be gone if I waited long enough, but the thought of him just standing there, knowing where I lived, made my skin crawl. The next morning, I rode back home. My hands felt shaky on the handlebars, my stomach twisted up in knots. When I turned onto my street, he wasn't there. Nothing looked out of place. The only thing different was the feeling that my home didn't feel as safe as it used to. I didn't tell my mom right away. It wasn't until a couple of days later, when my bike got stolen from the alleyway by the house, that I mentioned it. She decided not to call the police, just said it was probably a coincidence. Maybe it was, but maybe it wasn't. I never saw him again, but that night stayed with me. The way he looked at me, the way he screamed, the way he just knew. I don't ride alone at night anymore. I was 17 and had just gotten my license. It felt like freedom, like I finally had some control over where I could go and what I could do. Back in high school, my friends and I had made it a mission to find abandoned houses to throw parties in. It was stupid, yeah, but at the time it felt like the best idea ever. We had a few places that worked, some better than others. Some houses were just shells, half-built and left to rot, while others were older homes with dust-covered furniture and rotting walls. But then there was this one house, the Motherlode. I would pass it every night on my way home from work. It was huge, like a mansion that never got finished. The frame was up, parts of the walls were done, but there were no windows, no doors, just this massive husk of a house standing alone on a large plot of land. It was set back from the road, and the driveway stretched long enough that if you pulled in, you'd be completely hidden from passing cars. Perfect for a party. At least, that's what I thought. One day, before heading to see a movie, I told my friend about it. He wanted to see it for himself, so I figured why not. It was dusk, the summer air still warm, and the sky just beginning to darken. I pulled off the road and into the property, headlights sweeping across the unfinished house. The place was eerie, even in the fading light. It had an unnatural stillness to it, like the air itself didn't want to move. The front yard was overgrown, weeds pushing through the cracked dirt, and the structure loomed over us, empty and silent. We sat there for maybe 10 seconds, long enough to take in the scene. Then I shifted into reverse to back out. As soon as we were on the road, I noticed the truck. It wasn't there before. I didn't see it pull up, didn't hear an engine, but suddenly it was right behind us, its high beams cutting through my rear window. It was big, something like an old Ford or Chevy, jacked up, the kind of truck that made normal cars feel tiny. At first, I thought it was just a coincidence, but then the driver started tailgating. riding so close I could barely see the truck's hood in my mirror. My friend and I exchanged a glance, but didn't say anything. No big deal. Just some guy on the road. We kept driving toward the main road, waiting for the truck to back off, but it never did. Instead, it stayed on us, close enough that if I had tapped my brakes, he would have slammed into us. At the intersection, I put on my signal and turned right. That's when it got worse. Instead of following the road, the truck cut through the gas station on the corner, speeding ahead and then jerking to a stop right in front of us, blocking both lanes. I slammed on my brakes, tires screeching against the pavement. Everything felt off. The road, usually busy even at this hour, was empty. No cars, no people, just us and the truck. The driver's door swung open, and out came this huge guy. I don't mean just big, I mean massive, built like a damn linebacker. He moved fast, stomping toward us, and my heart was racing so hard I could hear it in my ears. He reached the driver's side and knocked on the window, not hard, not soft, just a steady, deliberate rap. I don't know why I rolled it down, but I did. The guy leaned in slightly, his face just visible in the glow of the dashboard lights. He asked us what we were doing at the house. I lied, said we were making a U-turn. It was the first thing that popped into my head, and I said it fast, hoping he'd just let it go. He stared at us for what felt like forever, eyes unreadable, then slowly, a smile crept onto his face. Not a friendly one, not a nice one, just a smile. Then he stepped back, gave a small nod, and walked back to his truck. He got in, put it in reverse, and backed away just enough for us to pass. I didn't wait. As soon as there was space, I hit the gas and sped past him, my hands gripping the wheel so tight my knuckles were white. We didn't speak. Not when we hit the next light, not when we merged onto the highway, not when we got to the movie theater. We just sat in the parking lot for a minute, breathing heavy, trying to process what had just happened. It wasn't until later that night, lying in bed, that it really sank in. The house was unfinished, abandoned. No lights, no signs of life. But someone was watching it. Someone cared enough to chase us down, to corner us on an empty road, to ask questions with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. The house was never completed. Year after year, it stayed the same, just a skeleton of what could have been. We never went back. No one else seemed to either. It was as if the place wasn't meant to be touched, like it existed outside of normal rules. Sometimes, when I drive by, I wonder about the man in the truck. I wonder if he still watches, waiting for someone else to pull in, waiting for another set of headlights to sweep across the empty shell of that house. I wonder what he would have done if I had told the truth. But mostly, I wonder how many people never got the chance to leave. I was 13, maybe 14, when it happened. My family lived on a farm in North Carolina, but not the kind with open fields and rows of crops. Ours was a pine tree farm, a pine harvestery, to be exact. Pine needles are valuable for landscaping, so instead of plowing dirt, we gathered pine straw, bundled it up, and sold it. That meant we lived in the middle of the woods, surrounded by 550 acres of straight, evenly spaced longleaf pines. It wasn't farmland. It was a forest that had been cut into perfect rows, stretching out for miles. It was quiet out there. Too quiet sometimes. The house was old, built by some dentist back in the 30s. It had a strange layout, full of odd angles and big, empty spaces. The weirdest part was the living room, which had a massive picture window that stretched nearly the entire length of the room, 50 feet at least. From that window, you could see out over a mile of trees uninterrupted. The house sat on a bit of a hill, so the living room was 5 or 6 feet off the ground, which gave the window a slightly downward angle into the forest. It was like looking into a never-ending tunnel of trees. During the winter, when the ground had just a bit of snow, the moonlight would bounce off it, lighting up the forest just enough to see shadows moving. I hated that window. It was too big, too open. At night, it felt like something was watching. One weekend, my cousin came over. We did what kids in the country do. Built a fire in the fireplace, and threw things into it to see what would happen. We made a fort out of couch cushions and blankets in the living room, stretching it across the floor near the fireplace. The fire burned low, and we settled in for the night, tired and warm. That's when the dogs started barking. We had a few, mostly for guarding the property. When they barked, it usually meant something was close, maybe a deer or a coyote. But this time, their barking was far away, deep in the woods. I figured they were chasing off some animal, nothing unusual. My cousin, though, was staring out the window, silent. I asked him what was up, but he didn't answer right away. He just kept looking. Then he said he thought he saw something. I sat up and looked too. At first, I saw nothing, just the endless rows of trees under the cold moonlight. But then there it was, a shadow moving between the trunks. Not fast, not running, just walking. It was maybe 100 yards from the house. We both froze. It could have been a trick of the light, the way the moon hit the ice, and snow sometimes played with your eyes. We waited, barely breathing. A few minutes passed. Then it happened again. Another shadow, another tree, 50 feet from where the first one had been. Neither of us spoke. We just watched. The figures weren't moving toward the house, not exactly. They were shifting, appearing between trees, always just at the edge of where the light caught them. The longer we watched, the more we realized they were getting closer. Slowly, deliberately. I wanted to wake my dad, but I knew what he'd do. He was the kind of man who handled things himself. If I woke him up, he'd go outside with his rifle, yelling into the dark. I wasn't sure I wanted that. Not yet. We still weren't sure if what we were seeing was real. Then one of them moved again. But this time, it didn't vanish behind a tree. It ran, fast, straight toward the house. We bolted. The living room suddenly felt too open, too exposed. I could feel that window behind me, like a gaping hole where something could look in. We raced down the hall to my dad's room, shook him awake, and told him what we saw. He grumbled, half asleep, and got up, but by the time we dragged him back to the living room, there was nothing there. Just trees, still and empty. He didn't call the cops. That wasn't how he handled things. Instead, we locked every door, every window. Out here, we rarely locked up. There was no need. But now, every lock clicked into place. My dad sat in the living room with us, his rifle propped against the wall. We didn't sleep. We just watched that window. In the morning, we went outside. The snow made it easy to see tracks. Footprints, leading from tree to tree, just like we'd seen. They circled the house, moving in closer and closer, stopping just beneath the window. Someone had stood there, watching us. But from our angle in the living room, they would have been hidden beneath the sill. If we hadn't gone to wake my dad, if we'd kept staring just a little longer, maybe they would have tried to get inside. We never found out who they were. The police weren't called. My dad just told us to be more careful. After that night, I never sat in that living room after dark again. And I never stopped wondering how long they had been watching before we noticed them.